Hello everyone, I know you are going to use this video for falling asleep, so before that, like this video, subscribe to the channel and let me know where you are from, also what time is it. It started with a whistling. Not just any whistling, not a tune you'd recognize, not a careless hum someone might make walking through a park on a sunny day. This was slow, deliberate. 3 notes. A pause. 3 again. High, low, high. Always the same. Always outside your window, no matter where you were. Jared figured it was a prank. Probably some neighborhood kid with nothing better to do. Except Jared had just moved to the sleepy town of Hensdale, into a house that hadn't been lived in since 1998. The neighbors stayed away. Most of the houses on the block had been sold, flipped, and filled with newer families, but the one next door was still boarded up. And across the street was a dense wall of trees. Not a park, just overgrowth. Too dark and tangled to be anything but ignored. The whistling started on his second night. He was brushing his teeth when he first noticed it. At first, he thought it was the wind. It wasn't. The tune repeated itself, slow and low, cutting through the late summer air with the kind of chill that doesn't come from temperature. The kind that comes from something older. Something wrong. He peered out the bathroom window. Darkness. The shape of the trees. Nothing else. When it happened again the next night, Jared tried to film it. He sat in the living room, lights off, phone in hand. Midnight came, and like clockwork, there it was. The whistling. But when he hit record and played it back, there was only silence. His voice whispering questions. The shuffle of his feet. But the whistling. Gone. Like it had never existed. By the end of the first week, he wasn't sleeping. The whistling followed him. He heard it at the grocery store, faint, near the freezer aisle. He turned, half, expecting to see someone behind him. But there was nothing but a small boy holding a bag of frozen peas, staring at him without blinking. "Do you hear it too?" Jared had asked. The boy didn't respond. He just slowly turned away, shuffled back to his mother, and whispered something. She glanced at Jared like he was diseased. He began to ask around, casually at first, at the gas station, at the diner, about the neighborhood, about the trees. But the moment he mentioned the whistling, conversations died. Eyes lowered. One old man mumbled something about old warnings, but wouldn't elaborate. Only Mrs. Rennett, the librarian, gave him anything worth chasing. "You shouldn't have moved into that house," she said plainly, pushing a brittle stack of microfiche toward him. "You're not the first." The articles were old. Yellowed even through the digital scan. The headlines were tame. Local man vanishes, family flees home, leaves belongings. Unexplained disappearances near Elkwood. But the dates? All linked to that address, 47 Lockwood Lane. And always, the stories included some variation of "I thought I heard someone whistling." One article, from 1987, was different. The woman who'd escaped was interviewed after her husband went missing. She described the sound, the feeling of dread. And then the final night he opened the door, she said, because he thought it was a child. "I told him not to. He went outside. And he never came back." Jared felt a weight settle in his chest, but he wasn't ready to believe it. Not fully. Not yet. Not until the phone calls began. He didn't give out his number, hadn't even updated it with the new area code. Yet every night at exactly 2:44 a.m., the landline, which he'd only connected for the internet install, rang once. Just once. On the 4th night, he picked up. Static, then the whistling. This time it was slower, drawn out, and behind it, breathing. He said nothing, frozen. Not even when the line went dead. He unplugged the phone. It rang anyway the next night. He left the house the following morning, checking into the only motel on the edge of town. Room 6. Cheap sheets. Buzzing light. It didn't matter. Anything was better than that house. Except the whistling came with him. He woke at 2:46 a.m. to the sound, soft at first, then louder, as if someone were pacing just outside the paper, thin door. He sat up, sweating. heart racing. He dared not move the curtain, but he didn't need to. The shadow underneath the door shifted slowly, back and forth. A pause. 3 steps. Another pause. Jared backed away until he hit the headboard. He stayed like that until dawn. He went back to the library the next day, eyes wild, voice shaking. Mrs. Rennet wasn't surprised. She pulled an envelope from her drawer, like she'd been waiting for him. "You're not the first to come running here," she said softly, "but you might be the last. There's something you need to see." The envelope was filled with photographs, black and white, all of the same thing. A figure standing at the edge of the woods near Lockwood Lane, always far away, always blurred. But it was the same height, the same outline. Sometimes, faintly, you could see the tilt of the head, like it was listening, or waiting. "Who took these?" he asked. "My husband," she said. 30 years ago. He heard the whistling too. What happened to him?" She didn't answer. That night, Jared decided to leave town. He didn't even go back to the house. He threw his things in the back of his car and started driving north, toward the freeway. But halfway through the turnpike, he saw someone standing on the side of the road, not thumbing for a ride, just standing, still, facing him. He swerved, pulled over, looked back. Nobody there. And then, in the back seat, behind the crackle of the worn leather, the whistle. 3 notes, a pause, 3 more. Jared didn't look. He floored the gas and didn't stop until the car choked on its own fumes 2 towns over. He was shaking so badly he dropped his phone when he tried to call the police. They found him curled under a bus stop, gibbering about sounds in the night. The paramedics took him in. He's still under observation. But that's not the real horror. The real horror is that the house at 47 Lockwood Lane is up for sale again. The listing says it's quiet, that it's perfect for a fresh start, and that it's ideal for someone seeking peace and isolation. They don't mention the phone calls, or the whistling, or the shadows. But if you look closely at the photos, there's something in the 3rd picture, just behind the edge of the tree line. It's small, almost out of frame, but it's there, a figure, still, waiting. And if you listen close enough, if you find yourself alone at night with nothing but the wind, you might hear it too. 3 notes, a pause, 3 again, high, low, high. And if you do, whatever you do, don't open the door. The motel reeked of old cigarette smoke and something beneath it, a thick, musty scent like rainwater trapped under floorboards. Jared sat on the edge of the lumpy mattress in room 6, staring at the floral curtains drawn tight against the night. He hadn't slept. Not really. Not since the figure outside his door had paced back and forth, casting that sliver of a shadow beneath the doorframe. The image played over and over in his head like a broken loop. The 3 steps, the pause, the low whistling, the breathing. Every part of him screamed that this wasn't a prank, that this wasn't some lost soul. There was something deliberate in how it moved, something that felt like it had all the time in the world. And worse, it knew he was afraid. Jared hadn't returned to the house. His keys were still in the glove box of the car he abandoned. He had nothing but his wallet, the clothes on his back, and the photos Mrs. Rennet had given him. They were folded in his jacket, damp from his sweat, the edges fraying more with every glance. He'd looked at them so often now, he could almost map out the shape of the figure's silhouette from memory. The tilt of the head, the way its arms always seemed to fall just a bit too long. The whistling hadn't followed him the next night. That, somehow, was worse. Silence wasn't comforting. It was a vacuum that made space for fear to breathe, to expand, to take hold in his chest like ice blooming across glass. He tried to convince himself it was over. Maybe the figure needed proximity. Maybe he'd escaped. But deep down, a splinter of him knew that wasn't true. Nothing about this felt like something you could just walk away from. It was past midnight when the knock came, not loud, not frantic, just firm. 2 knocks. A pause. Then a third, lighter one. Jared froze. The sound wasn't from the door, but the wall. The one that connected his room to the next. Room 7. He hadn't seen anyone check in there. The parking lot was still half empty, and the old man who ran the front desk hadn't mentioned any other guests. But now, someone, or something, was on the other side of that wall, knocking in that strange rhythm. 2 knocks, pause, then a third. He leaned forward, holding his breath. Silence. Then came the whisper, so soft he barely caught it. Come see. Jared jumped to his feet, knocking over the motel's plastic chair. He stood there, heart pounding, ears straining for more. Nothing. Just the wind outside brushing against the window pane, like dry fingertips. He waited a full minute before forcing himself to move. He stepped into the hallway, barefoot, every creak of the floorboards under him magnified in the motel's stillness. Room 7's door was closed. No light came from underneath. No sound. Just the lingering memory of the whisper. He pressed his ear to the door. Nothing. His hand reached for the knob before he could stop it. It wasn't locked. It turned easily. Too easily. And when he pushed it open, the door swung inward with a breathy sigh. The room was identical to his, down to the faded bedspread and the buzzing wall light, but there was no one inside. Except, on the bed was a photograph, black and white, just like the ones in his jacket. Only this one was different. It was him, standing outside the house on Lockwood Lane, keys in hand, back turned toward the woods. The blood drained from his face. His stomach twisted, bile crawling up his throat. The photo hadn't existed before. No one had been there when he first arrived. No one could have taken it. Not from that angle. It was shot from inside the trees. Jared backed out of the room, slammed the door, and rushed back to his own, locking it behind him. The walls felt thinner now, the ceiling lower. He sank to the floor, trembling. His breath came in short, shallow gasps, the motel's stale air too thick to fill his lungs. Then, under the door again, the shadow. It wasn't pacing this time. It was still, just standing there. And then, the whistling began. But this time it was wrong, off, key, slower. Like someone mocking the original tune, dragging it out to the point of breaking. And as the notes drew on, Jared noticed something new, a soft scratching in between the whistles. Like fingernails against wood. He didn't sleep. Not that night. Not the next. By the third day, he checked out. The old man at the front desk didn't ask questions. Just looked at Jared's sunken eyes and pale skin with a tired, knowing expression. Jared didn't even ask for directions. He just walked. Anywhere was better than that room. He wandered until he found the diner again. The same one he'd stopped at the week before. Inside, it was nearly empty. Just 2 old women whispering over coffee, and a teenage waitress who looked up at him with tired curiosity. He sat at the counter, hands shaking. "You okay?" she asked. He hesitated. "Then, do you know anything about the woods, near Lockwood?" She went still. A second passed. Then she leaned in and whispered, "You heard it too, didn't you?" Jared didn't respond. "My uncle, he used to say there's something buried out there. Not bones. Not bodies. Something older. Something that remembers." She looked around, lowered her voice further. "He called it the Whistler." Jared's skin prickled. He said if you hear it once, it notices you. If you hear it twice, it remembers you. But if it starts mimicking you, if it starts following, it means you're already dead. Just waiting to catch up. She slid a napkin toward him. He said the only way to break the attention is to confront it. Go to it. Finish the tune. But no one ever makes it through. Why not? She looked him dead in the eyes. Because no one wants to see what's on the other side of that sound. Jared left the diner without eating. He walked until dusk. Something in him knew this wasn't going away. Not now. Not ever. He could run until his legs gave out, but it would find him. Because it wasn't bound to the house. It wasn't even bound to the woods. It was bound to him. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, and the sky turned that gray, Violet shade just before full dark. Jared heard it again. Far away, but clear. 3 notes. Pause. 3 more. And this time, they came from inside his head. He dropped to his knees, clutching his ears, but it didn't stop. The whistle pulsed through his bones. And then, in a voice not his own, from lips he didn't feel move, he heard himself whisper, "Come see." The motel. The woods. The figure. It was all building to something. And Jared was beginning to understand a terrifying truth. It didn't want to kill him. Not yet. It wanted him to watch. The sun never really rose the next day. It just smeared gray light across the sky like an apology. Pale, thin, and indifferent. Jared sat on a cracked bench outside the gas station, just outside Hensdale, staring at the highway, but not seeing it. Cars passed in the distance, blurred by mist. None stopped. He hadn't moved for hours. Not since the whistling reached inside him the night before. Not since he'd heard his own voice speak words he didn't will. Come see. That wasn't an invitation. It was a command. Something had taken root in him, something heavy and sick and watching. And it was only growing. He hadn't slept in days. His skin was damp with cold sweat, his hands raw from where he'd clawed at his ears during the night, trying to dig the sound out. But the whistle wasn't outside anymore. It was inside. Living in the hollow behind his ribs, breathing in rhythm with him. When he closed his eyes, he could see a shape standing between trees. Motionless, head tilted, waiting for him to move. Waiting for him to come closer. It didn't need to chase him. It knew he'd come. The decision wasn't his anymore. By mid-afternoon, Jared stood at the tree line behind 47 Lockwood Lane. The house loomed behind him, still dark and empty, but somehow it no longer felt like the source. The house had just been the door. The woods were what waited through it. That's where the sounds came from. That's where the rules didn't apply. He hadn't told anyone where he was going. There wasn't anyone left to tell. Even Mrs. Rennett had stopped answering her phone. The last time they spoke, she told him quietly that she was done helping things find names. That night, her library was found empty, all the windows blacked out, the door wide open. No one had seen her since. Jared stared into the trees. There was no path, no trail. But still, his feet moved forward, like they remembered a route he'd never walked. The forest swallowed sound. Every step he took was muffled, as if the earth itself didn't want to acknowledge his presence. The branches overhead twisted into unnatural arches, like the woods were folding inward to hide something, or protect it. There were no birds, no insects, no wind. Just a stillness so total it pressed against his ears like cotton. Then he heard the first breath that wasn't his own. Soft, measured. Not behind him. Not ahead, above. He froze and looked up slowly. There was nothing there, just the interlocked branches. Their bark, warped and darker than it should have been, pulsing faintly like veins. And then a sound, not a whistle this time, but something that tried to be one. Off pitch, broken, like a damaged throat mimicking a flute. Jared kept walking. The deeper he went, the more the forest seemed to forget what it was supposed to be. Trees grew at wrong angles, some spiraling, some merging like melted candles. The ground dipped and rose without reason. At one point, he stepped forward only to find that he was somehow walking in reverse, his footprints forming ahead of him in the soil. He blinked, tried to turn around, but the direction was gone. Every compass in his mind stopped spinning. Then he saw the photograph, pinned to the side of a tree with what looked like a shard of bone. Another black and white shot. This time him, in the motel bathroom. Hunched over the sink, mouth open, screaming. Except he didn't remember screaming. And yet the pain in his throat suddenly flared. Raw and hoarse. It had been watching even then. Following hadn't been enough. It wanted to document him. He pulled the photo down, but as he did, something shifted behind the tree. Just a flicker of movement in the corner of his eye. He turned, heart slamming into his ribs, but there was only forest. Except one of the trees had a face. At first glance, it looked like knots in the bark. A trick of shadow. But the longer he stared, the clearer it became. Two eye sockets, a nose slanted sideways, a mouth twisted into a gape. And it was screaming. He stumbled back, but his foot struck something solid. Another photo. This one lying flat on the ground. A group of children. 5 of them, dressed in old clothes. Blank-eyed, mouths stitched shut, literally, with dark thread. Their hands were raised in front of them like they were shielding themselves from something above. One child's hand was crushed, flattened unnaturally, and beneath the photo, carved into the dirt in a long, curling script, was one word: return. The trees shifted again. Not wind, but something deeper, a pressure change, the way a room feels right before the lights go out. Then came the singing, not in English, not in any language Jared recognized. Low, rhythmic syllables repeated like a chant, winding between the trunks and branches. The voices weren't nearby, not yet, but they were closing in. Every syllable sounded wet. He ran. It was instinct. Primal. No logic to it, just the urge to get away from the sound that wasn't meant for human ears. But the forest didn't let him run far. His legs carried him forward for what felt like miles, and yet the trees never changed. The landmarks stayed the same, the twisted arch, the stone shaped like a screaming mouth, the face, tree, always to his left. Time broke apart. His watch blinked numbers that didn't make sense. The sun never moved. He didn't know how long he'd been running when he fell into the clearing. It opened suddenly like the woods were exhaling. A perfect circle ringed with scorched grass. In the center a hole, not a pit, not a cave. A hole. Pure black, edges lined with handprints. Dozens of them. Burned into the ground like shadows from a blast. Above the hole, suspended by nothing, hung a single object, a tooth, human, large, rotting. But it floated in place, turning slowly, impossibly still, and beside it, hanging from a branch that had grown horizontally into the center of the clearing, was a noose. No rope, just hair. Jared couldn't move. Every part of him screamed to run, to claw his way back through the trees, to forget everything he'd seen. But his body wasn't listening anymore. Because something else was here. It stepped from the shadows at the far edge of the clearing, where no light should have reached, not even the pale sky above. It didn't walk. It unfolded, limbs too long, skin that seemed to pulse, and from its mouth a jagged, broken whistle, trying desperately to sound like a tune. The tune. Jared didn't scream. Couldn't. The figure tilted its head, mimicking the photograph. The same posture, the same angle. Then it did something Jared hadn't expected. It pointed, past him, toward the hole. And in that moment, Jared felt something collapse in his mind. A wall he didn't know existed. He saw flashes. Children walking backward into the woods. People screaming into empty motel rooms. Mrs. Rennet scribbling something in a book before throwing herself into a fire. And above it all, the tune. Over and over and over. A song sung to summon, but not summon it. Summon you. Jared turned back to the hole. He didn't want to move forward, but his feet did, and as he stepped toward the void, the last thing he heard before he fell was his own voice. Whistling. There was no impact when Jared hit the bottom. No jolt, no pain, no darkness, even. Just the sound of air folding in on itself, and the distant echo of his own whistle, drifting into silence like a breath held too long. He had the sensation of falling, but it wasn't vertical. It was inward, as if he was being drawn not through space, but through something else. Something thinner than reality, something stretched taut like skin over bone. And for a long time, there was nothing. No light, no feeling. Just the slow, dragging weight of movement that didn't belong to his body. Then, color. Not bright, not even real. But color nonetheless, bleeding in at the corners of his vision, like water seeping through walls. Pale reds, sickly greens. A gray so dense it felt almost physical. Shapes began to form around him, shifting and warping, walls that weren't made of stone or wood, but flesh. They pulsed gently, and the surface under his feet, if it could be called that, gave slightly with each step, like walking across the back of some breathing creature buried just beneath the world. Jared blinked. Once. Twice. And then he realized he hadn't blinked since the fall began. He hadn't needed to. There was no wind, no moisture, no dust in this place. Nothing alive. Nothing moving, except the walls and the distant twitching of something just out of sight. There was no sound, either, not at first. Just the horrible absence of it, like the air had been thickened into gel. But as he walked deeper, or perhaps as the place moved around him, the sound returned. A whistle, but not the one he knew. This one was slower, guttural, like someone trying to force breath through a crushed throat. It came in bursts, uneven, rising and falling without pattern. And beneath it, layered so faintly he almost missed it, was something worse. Children. Laughing. Only the laughter didn't rise with joy. It dragged like chains, mocking, hollow. Jared staggered forward, mouth dry, every step echoing with a squelch. The tunnel, if it was one, began to narrow, the fleshy walls closing in until his shoulders brushed against them with each movement. Faces emerged from the surface now. Not sculpted, not carved, imprinted. Dozens of them, eyes wide, mouths frozen in silent screams. Some looked familiar, the stitched children from the photograph, the woman from the article, even Mrs. Rennet. All trapped beneath the skin of this place, their features distorting as if pressing against a thin sheet from the other side. He didn't know where he was, only that it wasn't a place he was meant to see. This wasn't hell. That would have been a comfort. This was before hell, a waiting room for something older. Suddenly, the floor dropped. Not far, just enough to jolt him. The tunnel widened, then spilled him into a chamber. Circular, endless, lit by a pulsing red glow that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. The air was thick with a metallic stench, like rust and rot soaked into cloth. Across the chamber, etched into the walls in lines that pulsed with faint light, was writing, not in any language he knew, not symbols, not words, but marks, slashes, spirals, twists. He stared at them, and they twitched, moved, not like something alive, more like something noticing it had been seen. And that's when it appeared. Not the figure from before, not the whistler. This was something different. It crawled from the wall like a spider unfolding itself, its limbs bending too many times in the wrong places. It didn't walk, it dripped, sliding down in pieces, pulling itself together as it approached. Its skin was slick, like it had just emerged from birth, yet parts of it were dry and flaking, as if it had been dead for centuries. Its head was a mask of mouths, dozens layered on top of each other, all breathing in unison, none of them opening. And then it spoke. But not in words, not in any sound Jared could describe. It was a feeling, pushed into him, a concept, like being drowned in someone else's memory. You heard the song. Now you are part of it. Jared screamed, but the sound never left his mouth. It stayed trapped in his throat, swallowed by the air around him. The thing leaned closer, and the mouths began to move, whistling. Not the tune he knew, a new one, longer, deeper, and his body responded. His hands began to move without his command. His arms stretched upward, fingers splayed. His spine arched back until it felt like it might snap. The whistle poured through him, not from his lips but from inside his chest, like a pipe organ set loose beneath his ribs. He couldn't stop it. He was becoming it. The chamber began to shift around him. The walls peeled back, revealing hundreds of others, trapped in half-formed bodies, locked in poses of agony, all whistling the same horrible tune. Some had no faces. Some had too many. And all of them had the same eyes, empty, black, open too wide. Jared tried to run, but his legs twisted beneath him. The chamber wouldn't let him leave. The thing reached out with one dripping hand, touched his shoulder, and for a second he saw. He saw the original moment, the first whistler. A boy, small, alone in the woods, cold, humming to himself. The tune, simple, innocent, and something heard it. Something in the soil, in the spaces between roots. It answered. And then it needed the song, and it made sure it would never be forgotten. Passed on, one listener at a time, one echo after another. Each whistle a hook, each breath a chain. Jared was next. The thing's hands sank into his skin without breaking it, merging with him, filling him. He screamed again, but it was music now. The tune reshaped his cries, and through the chamber, every trapped soul began to whistle in unison, their bodies twitching with shared rhythm. But just as Jared's eyes began to fade, just as he felt his own voice lost to the air, something shifted. A flash, not light. A camera shudder. And then everything shattered. The chamber broke into pieces, folding back like glass melting in reverse. Jared fell again, not into darkness, but into cold. Wet grass, the real world, he gasped. Above him was the sky, night, stars. He was lying in the clearing behind the house. The hole was gone. The tree branch with the noose, gone. Only the burned ring of grass remained. And beside him, resting neatly on the dirt, was a photograph, black and white, of him in the chamber, eyes wide, mouth open, whistling. Jared didn't stand at first. He couldn't. His limbs didn't work the way they used to. Every part of him trembled, not with cold, but with a strange disconnection. Like his body was no longer his, as if something had borrowed it and hadn't quite returned it whole. The grass beneath him was wet, slick with dew, but it didn't feel real. Not like how it should, damp and cool. It felt distant, blurred. The photograph lay beside him, edges curling slightly in the breeze. He forced himself to look at it. It was grainy, black and white like all the others. His face was distorted, mouth stretched in a whistle, eyes rolled back. Behind him in the image, the chamber loomed, real, textured, unmistakable. But the worst part wasn't that he was whistling. It was that someone had taken the photo. He hadn't been alone down there. That realization hit him harder than the fall. He scrambled up on shaking legs, breathing in shallow gasps. The house at 47 Lockwood loomed behind the trees like a silent witness, its windows like watching eyes. He didn't go back. He couldn't. Whatever lived in that house wasn't just in the house. It was in him now. He staggered toward the road, unsure where to go, unsure what time it was. His phone was still missing, either left in the motel or taken when he'd fallen. But time had stopped making sense anyway. The sky was still dark, yet the stars had shifted. He couldn't tell if it was late at night or almost morning. And still, he felt watched. Not just watched, followed. He made it into town just as the sun began to break the horizon. The streets were empty. Storefronts shuttered. Even the birds seemed hesitant to start the day. When he passed the diner, the windows were dark. The open sign flickered once and went out. Inside, he saw the waitress again, the one who'd warned him. She was sitting in the corner booth, staring at something in her hands. Another photograph. She looked up and met his eyes through the glass. Her expression didn't change. No shock, no relief, just a hollow stare. And she held the photo up for him to see. It was him again. But not from the forest, not from the chamber. This one was taken just seconds ago, outside the diner where he now stood, showing him staring at her through the window. Jared recoiled. That wasn't possible. There'd been no click, no shutter, no flash. But the angle, the detail, someone or something had taken it in real time. He turned, scanned the street. Empty. He pushed into the diner, the bell above the door silent. The woman didn't move. She simply slid the photo across the table as he approached. "I told you," she whispered. "It remembers." He sat down across from her, not bothering to ask how she got the picture. He didn't want to know. "There's more," she said, pulling out a stack of photos from a crumpled paper bag beside her. She spread them across the table like tarot cards. Jared's heart stopped. Each photo showed him in places he'd never been. A dimly lit hallway, walls lined with mirrors. A long corridor of doors stretching into pitch black. A room filled with rows of beds, each with a figure lying motionless, their faces hidden beneath sheets. But all the photos had one thing in common: he was always looking away. Always facing something out of frame. And in every single photo, somewhere in the background, was the Whistler, sometimes just a shadow near a window, sometimes a blur on the edge, but always there, waiting. "They call it the man in the photo," she whispered. "It doesn't chase you, it frames you, builds your ending in snapshots, until there's nothing left to capture." She handed him the last photo in the pile. "This one hasn't happened yet," she added. He stared. It was of a motel room. Room 6, the curtains drawn, a chair overturned. His own body, twisted on the bed, neck bent unnaturally to the side. Blood trailing from his ear. Mouth open in a silent whistle. "No," Jared said, shoving the photo away. "I found that one on my windshield this morning," she said. "Someone wanted me to see it. Or maybe someone wanted you to." He stood abruptly. The walls of the diner felt like they were folding inward. He needed air, movement, anything to outrun the image in his mind. But when he turned toward the exit, the bell above the door rang before he touched it. The door opened on its own, and standing just outside, face half shadowed by morning light, was a man. Not distorted, not grotesque, just wrong. His smile was slightly too wide, his posture slightly too still. His eyes locked with Jared's, and in that moment, he knew. The Whistler had a face now. It was his. The man raised a hand slowly, and with a single crooked finger, pointed at the camera hanging around his neck. Old, rusted, the kind you wound by hand. Then he lifted it, aimed it at Jared. Click. Jared blinked, and the man was gone, vanished. But in the silence that followed, a photo developed in the tray on the counter beside the register. The waitress stepped forward, trembling, and pulled it out. She held it up. Jared's face, mid-scream, mouth open wide, the words frozen on his lips. In the background, the Whistler, standing behind him, whispering something into his ear, and scrawled across the bottom of the photo, in dark ink, frame by frame. Jared didn't wait. He left the diner, bolting down the street like a man on fire. The photos had become more than images. They were events, predictions, evidence of something already decided. And the worst part was, he couldn't remember when the camera first found him. He couldn't remember when he started posing. He found the motel again, not by choice. His feet brought him there, unthinking. The sign buzzed overhead, a few letters flickering. Room 6 was empty. But on the bed, neatly centered like a gift, lay the final photograph from the diner. He stared at it, and something inside him broke. The future wasn't coming. It was here. And as he looked up from the photo, the room already began to shift. The shadows stretched longer. The mirror cracked down the center. The air pressed in like a mouth about to close. And behind him, just out of frame, the camera clicked once more. The door closed behind him without a sound. Jared didn't touch it. He hadn't meant to step inside room 6 again. Every instinct in him screamed against it, begged him to run, to burn the place to the ground, to disappear. But instinct was no longer in control. Something deeper had taken over. Something slow and patient, like ivy wrapping around a building, pulling it down one crumbling stone at a time. The moment he crossed the threshold, the air shifted. Time folded, and room 6 no longer felt like a place. It felt like a loop, a trap replaying itself in increments. The room was exactly as he remembered it. The same moth-bitten curtains, the cracked linoleum, the humming from the old light fixture that never stayed lit. But there was something new now. The smell, it was thicker. Not rot, not exactly, something sour. Like spoiled memories curdling in the corners. And silence pressed on everything. Even the buzzing light had quieted. It wasn't absence of sound. It was muted panic, like fear had been swallowed and digested, so long it no longer made noise. The photograph still lay on the bed, the one from the diner. His body bent at an unnatural angle. The thin trickle of blood, the mouth open wide in a whistle that could only have come from something inside him. Not breath, not will. He picked it up again, fingers trembling. The image was wrong, though. Something had changed. In the corner, faint and blurry, a new figure had appeared. Not the whistler. Smaller. Watching from the mirror's edge. A boy, maybe. Or something shaped like one. Before he could react, the mirror across the room cracked again. This time, on its own. A new line sliced through it from top to bottom, clean and fast. Jared flinched, but didn't move. He watched as dust blood from the fracture, floating in the still air. Then, slowly, almost shyly, a hand emerged from the mirror. Small, colorless. Fingers trembling. He stepped back. The hand withdrew. The mirror returned to stillness, but the air had changed. It felt thinner. Like the oxygen was being siphoned out. Jared struggled to breathe, each inhale heavier than the last. He turned toward the bathroom door. It was open now. It hadn't been a second ago. From inside came a drip, just one, then two. Then a slow, deliberate splash, like a foot settling into water. The lights flickered. The whistle returned, but not the familiar three-note tune. This one was fractured, a jagged lullaby. A distortion, like a record melting under heat. The sound pulled at something in Jared's mind. Not memory. Exactly. Something before memory. Something inherited. He didn't recognize it, but part of him remembered it. He moved toward the bathroom with leaden feet. Inside, the light was dim. Yellow. Faintly humming. The mirror above the sink had turned to mist. Not steam. Not fog. Mist. Something unnatural and alive, writhing across the glass like fingers dragging from the other side. His reflection was gone. Only the mist remained. And in the center of the sink was another photo. He picked it up with numb hands. This one was worse. It showed room 6, but twisted. The walls were scorched black. The bed was gone. Chains hung from the ceiling like puppeteer strings. On the floor was a circle of chairs, each one filled with a copy of him. Dozens of Jareds. Different clothes, different injuries, different expressions. All with mouths open. All whistling. And in the center, sitting on the floor with its back turned, was the boy from the mirror. Or what looked like a boy. Jared turned, heart pounding. The room behind him had changed. It wasn't room 6 anymore. The bed was gone, replaced by rusted cot frames. The windows were bricked up. The ceiling sagged, soaked with something that dripped in slow, thick droplets. He backed away instinctively, his heel hitting something soft. Another photograph. It showed him now, in that very moment, turning around to look behind him. Someone was standing in the corner of the room. He looked up. Nothing there. Then, blink. The figure was now directly beside the bed. Another blink, at the foot of the cot. Blink. Behind him. He spun, swinging wildly at air. But his hand passed through nothing. The photograph fluttered to the floor again, but the image had changed. The figure's face was now clear, and it was his, but not him. The mouth was open too wide. The eyes were black, and from the throat, instead of a whistle, spilled film, long strips of negatives pouring endlessly, coiling like snakes around the photo. A new voice spoke, low and distorted. "You are being developed." Jared staggered, clutching his temples. The walls of the room seemed to throb now, as though reacting to the words. Photographs began sliding from the walls themselves, emerging like sheets from a printer. One after another, hundreds, thousands, all of them of him, in every possible moment, brushing teeth, crying in a shower, standing at his childhood window, sitting alone in the dark, looking at his hands, sleeping, always sleeping, even ones that shouldn't exist. Images of him in the womb, of him screaming the moment he was born, of his parents holding him, and behind them, always in the background, the whistler, blurry and patient. The photos fell to the floor, and the sound they made was deafening. Not paper, not weight, but screams. All of them, voices frozen in ink, trapped inside photographs. Jared screamed back, clutching his head, trying to shut it out. But the scream came out wrong. Too flat. Too controlled. The whistle. It wasn't his anymore. It belonged to the room. To them. And then he saw it. The boy. Standing now at the foot of the bed. Pale. Expressionless. His eyes were gouged out. Black pits. But he wasn't bleeding. Instead, a roll of film unspooled slowly from each socket, twitching, slithering toward Jared's feet. The boy opened his mouth, and inside was a shutter, like a camera. Click. Everything stopped. Silence. The photographs fluttered to the ground like dead leaves. The room reset. Jared found himself standing at the entrance of room 6 again. Same chair. Same curtains. No blood. No photos. No cracked mirror. Just quiet. And on the nightstand a single envelope. Inside it a new photo. Blank. Except for a single line. Hand scrawled in ink at the bottom. You haven't been framed yet. But you're standing still. And in that moment, Jared understood something that made his knees buckle. It wasn't the camera that captured you. It was your stillness. The second you stopped fighting, stopped moving, stopped changing, that's when it took you. That's when you became a moment, not a man. And the whistler, it didn't come to haunt. It came to preserve. One soul at a time, one frame at a time, forever. Jared didn't sleep that night, not that he thought he ever would again. Room 6 remained motionless around him, perfectly still, as if waiting to see what he would do next. He didn't dare blink for too long. Every time he did, the walls seemed to pulse. Once, he thought he saw the doorknob turn, just a twitch, like a breath held in by the room itself, but nothing followed. The envelope with the blank photo sat on the nightstand, untouched, a reminder that whatever force watched him wasn't finished. It was patient. It could wait. It enjoyed waiting. When the morning light filtered in through the dusty curtains, Jared didn't feel relief. It only made the room look more artificial. The sunlight didn't move, didn't shift with the hours. It simply was static and wrong, as if it had been painted on the outside of the window. He moved to open the curtain, hoping for a glimpse of something. Anything that made sense. What he saw made his blood run cold. Outside, the world was gone. There was no parking lot, no motel sign, no street, no sky, just white noise. It shimmered like TV static, endless and consuming, stretching out beyond the glass in every direction. It flickered subtly, as though something behind it were trying to push through, but it remained blurred, deliberately out of reach. The only thing Jared could make out was the faint outline of the motel sign in the distance, frozen mid-flicker. Even that felt unreal, like a copy of a memory rather than the memory itself. He touched the glass. It was ice cold. The air around it hummed, not loudly, not violently, just persistently, like the kind of hum that builds in your teeth before a headache. When he pressed his fingers against the glass, the static shimmered harder, as if responding to his presence. And then, slowly, something moved on the other side. A shape, vague, human, standing just past the noise. It didn't walk closer. It was just there, the way a shadow is suddenly beside you when the sun shifts. One moment, the space was empty. The next, it was filled. Jared stumbled back, heart hammering, eyes glued to the shape beyond the window. It didn't move, but somehow he knew it was watching him. There was no face to speak of, no features, just the impression of eyes. And then the sound began, not the whistle. Worse, it was his voice, whispering something he couldn't understand. Words slurred together, too low and fast to follow, but undeniably his. It repeated on a loop, each time a little clearer, louder, until finally he caught a single phrase, unmistakable in its tone and message, "Don't look away." Jared blinked. The figure was now inside the room. It stood in the corner. Its body blurred at the edges like something caught mid-glitch. It twitched in tiny spasms, as if trying to stay in place, as if standing still took immense effort. It didn't approach. It didn't speak. It just stared. And every time Jared tried to focus on it, its face distorted further, reshaping with a wet squelch into something new. First his mother, then the waitress, then Mrs. Rennet, then himself. Each time the face shifted, the room groaned softly, like old wood bending under weight. A photograph fell from the ceiling, drifting slowly to the ground. Jared didn't want to look, but he did. This one was different. It showed the figure at the window. Not from his perspective, from outside. As though someone else had taken the photo while watching the creature watching him. Which meant there was another watcher. The thought cracked something open in him. A terrible, gnawing question. If this presence was mimicking him, using his voice, stealing his face, framing him in still images, then who was holding the camera? And more importantly, where were they standing? The answer came with a sudden burst of static across the room. The motel television, dead and unplugged, snapped to life. No picture. Just a wall of noise. And then, one by one, images began to push through the distortion. Flickering moments. Jared brushing his teeth. Jared walking through the woods. Jared standing in room 6. Each shot glitching, skipping, repeating. The transitions between them grew faster. Harder. Until finally the screen froze. A live image of him. Right now, standing in front of the TV, he turned slowly to look at the wall behind him. Where the mounted camera above the bathroom door stared down, a red light blinking faintly that hadn't been on before. The static resumed, and the image vanished. Jared felt something tighten around his chest, a pressure like hands gripping just beneath his ribs. He stumbled back, and his foot caught on something solid. Another envelope. He hadn't seen it before. He picked it up with shaking hands and opened it. Inside 2 photographs. One showed room 6, empty. The bed, the chair, the TV, all still. The second showed the same room, same angle, but this time, Jared lay motionless on the floor, mouth open, film leaking from between his lips. But it was the note inside that made his blood freeze, typed in block letters YW left TTHE 1 Jared spun toward the curtains. They were open. He hadn't opened them. The window now hung slightly ajar, and the static had stopped. There was no sound, no hum, just silence, too complete, too absolute. Then, a breath behind him. Warm, human. He turned, but there was no one there. The mirror, cracked and graying, reflected only the room. No Jared, no shadow. Just emptiness. Like the photo had already been taken, and he was no longer part of it. And outside, from somewhere deep within the static haze beyond the window, the whistle returned. 3 notes, pause. 3 more. This time, it was in harmony. 2 whistles, perfectly matched. One outside the frame, one from within. And Jared finally understood. Room 6 never ends. Because the moment you step inside, you become part of the picture. Jared didn't remember falling asleep. In fact, he was certain he hadn't. And yet, when his eyes opened again, he was no longer in room 6. He was somewhere else, somewhere colder. The floor beneath him was concrete, rough against his cheek, and the air had that unmistakable smell of metal and damp stone, the kind you only find in places meant to be buried. He pushed himself upright slowly, every muscle stiff, aching like they'd been locked in place too long. The walls were gray, smooth, almost too clean. There were no windows, no door that he could see. Just the humming, low and steady, like an engine running far below. He stood, disoriented. The last thing he remembered was the window in room 6, the sudden silence, and that breath at his back. He had turned, hadn't he? But then, nothing. Not blackness, not pain. Just missing time. As though someone had snipped the film and let the reel jump forward. As he moved, the lights above buzzed faintly. There were no shadows, only the dull wash of white light from above. The kind hospitals use when they want you to feel small. Trapped, that's when he noticed the mirrors. There were 5 of them, positioned around the room in irregular angles, none of them facing directly forward. Each one was tall, reaching from the floor to the ceiling. Each had the same silvering around the edges, like old glass, but none of them reflected him properly. They tried to, but each image showed him slightly wrong. In the first, his face was too narrow, his eyes wide and panicked. A faint trickle of blood running from his ear. In the second, he was sitting instead of standing, clutching his chest. Mouth stretched into a scream that never seemed to move. The third showed him as a child, alone, staring up at something beyond the frame. Eyes blacked out. The fourth, he couldn't look at the fourth. Not for more than a second. There was something behind the reflection of him. Something tall, arched, and bent forward like it was whispering directly into his skull. Its face wasn't visible, only its mouth, always open, always whistling. He turned away, heart pounding, but the fifth mirror caught his attention with a sudden flicker. The image within it was alive, moving in real time, like a screen. He stepped closer, cautiously. It was another room, wooden floors, peeling wallpaper, a bed with neatly folded sheets, a window with the curtain pulled half open, a small desk, and someone sitting at it. Someone familiar. His breath caught. It was him. But not him now. Him from before. From weeks ago. Back when everything still made sense. Before the house. Before the whistling. This Jared was writing something in a notebook, headphones in, humming softly to a song that no longer existed. The mirror was showing the past. A frozen moment. A time before the frame began to tighten. Jared reached for the glass instinctively. His fingers touched the surface, and it rippled like water. Then the reflection snapped its head up. The past, Jared stared directly at him, no longer humming, no longer calm. And then he smiled, the kind of smile Jared had never worn. Wide, too wide. The skin at the corners of the mouth cracked slightly, but the grin held. The figure reached forward, placing its hand on the inside of the glass, palm against Jared's. Jared recoiled. Too late, the mirror pulled him in. He was weightless, tumbling through liquid air. The sound of the hum growing louder until it became a roar. He fell. Not physically, but mentally, falling through thoughts, memories, flickers of time. A birthday party at age 6. The first night in his college dorm, waking up from a nightmare he no longer remembered. Each moment passing like a strobe, too fast to grab, but vivid enough to hurt. Then silence. And when he landed, he wasn't in the gray room anymore. He was inside the mirror, and it was watching through his eyes. He realized it slowly, as he tried to move and his body didn't respond. He stood in a room that looked like room 6 but wasn't. The walls were newer. No peeling wallpaper. No humming light. Just a calm, perfect stillness. But he couldn't turn his head. Couldn't look away. His hands moved, but not by his command. He was a passenger now. The figure in control wore his face, but every motion was slightly off. Too smooth, too slow. The kind of imitation you see in dreams, where nothing feels grounded. It reached into the nightstand and pulled out a photograph. A new one. On it, a young woman in her kitchen. Turning to look at the camera, her expression neutral. Behind her, a figure blurred in the hallway. Then another. A child in bed asleep. A man-shaped shadow at the foot of the mattress. Another. A security camera feed of a parking garage. Jared, or the thing wearing Jared, standing behind a pillar, watching a man fumble with his keys. Dozens more. Each a moment. A life caught mid-frame. A victim to be. Frozen just before the whistle. The imitation, Jared picked up a pen and began writing on the back of one of the photos. Jared couldn't see the words, but he felt them being written. Heavy, final. Like the caption on a headstone. And then the body stood, walked to the mirror, looked into it. Jared's face stared back, but his eyes were no longer his. Behind them was something ancient, patient, and hungry. Then the thing blinked, and Jared was back, sitting upright in room 6 once more. Alone. But everything felt wrong now. His body ached, not from exhaustion but from use, as if someone had borrowed it. His mouth was dry, and his lips, they were chapped, cracked, and when he exhaled, soft and slow, the sound that left his throat wasn't a sigh. It was a whistle, one he didn't mean to make. And outside the motel, through the warped curtain of the window, A child stopped walking, turned slowly, and stared directly at room 6. He'd been seen. The frame was set. And the cycle had begun again. It began again with a knock. Not the loud kind, not the panicked kind, but the kind that sounds like someone who knows you're inside. Soft, patient, too patient. Jared didn't move. He sat on the floor of room 6, back against the bed frame, eyes fixed on the door like it might peel open on its own. His body still ached from whatever had worn it while he was gone. If he had been gone. If that mirror hadn't just been some awful hallucination born from sleeplessness and pressure and fear. But he knew better. The whistle that had slipped from his lips wasn't his. It had been trained, like a signature passed down. Something inherited. And whoever had been at the window, whoever had seen him, they were part of it now too. The knock came again. This time, followed by a sound more jarring than any voice could have been, a child's laugh. Short, mirthless, a sound designed to sound innocent, just long enough to make you doubt everything. Jared stood, swaying on his feet. His reflection in the dark television screen looked older somehow. Drawn, thinner. But it wasn't just the wariness. There was something else in his eyes now, like the beginning of a film reel clicking into motion. A memory not yet formed. He crossed the room slowly and pressed his ear to the door. Silence. He waited. Then, just as he was about to turn away, whistle. 3 notes. A pause. 3 more. Directly on the other side of the door. He didn't open it. He wouldn't. Instead, he backed away, crossing the room, drawing the curtains to make sure that at least one line of sight was gone. But when he looked through the slit in the fabric, the world outside had changed again. The static from before was gone. But so was the world. It wasn't fog. It wasn't light. It was simply white. Endless. A blank page waiting for something to be written. In the distance stood the child, still, facing room 6. Not moving. Jared stared. The boy was pale, wearing clothes a size too large, and in his hands was something small and square. At first, Jared thought it was a toy. Then he saw the flash. A camera. Old, boxy, with a crank on the side. The child raised it slowly, even though the glass of the motel window should have blocked his view, and aimed it directly at Jared. There was no doubt in the angle. No guesswork. It was perfect. Click. Jared flinched. When he looked again, the boy was gone. The blank outside remained, humming faintly. But the child, the camera, the shape vanished. Then, behind him, the sound of paper sliding. He turned to find a new photograph beneath the door. His hands trembled as he picked it up. It was taken from the outside, from the same angle the boy had been standing. It showed Jared, standing just as he was now, peeking between the curtain, staring out. And behind him in the photograph was a new figure. Not the whistler. Not the boy. Another Jared. This one had his head tilted back, his mouth open wide. But no sound was coming out. Because something was being poured in. Film. Long, black strips feeding into his throat like tape into a machine. He dropped the photo, bile rising in his throat. He had to leave. He had to get out. Whatever had started was reaching too far now. The mirrors, the photographs, the imitations, they weren't just ghosts or memories. They were versions, replicas, made with intention. And somehow he was being overwritten. He threw open the door and bolted down the hallway of the motel. Every room he passed was identical. Room 6, every single door. Each labeled with a tarnished brass plate, each humming faintly. He turned corners that shouldn't exist. He passed the same vending machine 3 times. The hallway stretched endlessly, rooms repeating like a reel looped back on itself. Eventually, his sprint slowed, not from fatigue, but futility. He was inside it now. The photo, the motel, the myth. He reached for the next doorknob, ready to force it open, but it turned on its own. Light spilled out. He stepped in. A kitchen, not the motel, a small, modern kitchen. Sink full of dishes. Family photos on the fridge, and sitting at the table was the boy, calm, drinking juice from a plastic cup. In front of him sat a photo album, one Jared recognized instantly, the same one from his childhood home. He stepped forward, but the floor creaked and the boy looked up. His eyes weren't black. They weren't white. They were glass. Reflective. Lenses. The boy smiled, then opened the album and turned it toward Jared. Page after page of photographs, all of them of Jared, but aging in reverse, from now to last week, to college, high school, childhood, until the last image a baby, wide-eyed, screaming, tiny, and above the crib a figure caught mid-motion, tall, thin, shadowed, holding a camera. Click. Then the photo shimmered and changed. Now the crib was empty, the baby gone. Only the camera remained, and Jared's name etched in ink across the bottom, followed by one word: replacement. He looked up. The boy was gone. The room was gone, and he was back in room 6. Only this time he wasn't inside. He was looking at it, from outside the glass, standing in static, camera in hand, watching himself, waiting for the perfect moment to click. Jared watched himself through the motel window, still and strange, like a wax figure slumped on the edge of the bed. The version inside wasn't doing anything. Not breathing, not blinking, just waiting. But Jared couldn't tell who was really waiting anymore. Him, trapped in the blank world, outside with a camera gripped in cold hands, or the other one, the thing wearing his body like a costume too tight to fit clean. The air around him hummed low, the static less noisy now and more alive, breathing with him, anticipating. The glass of the motel window no longer reflected anything. No clouds, no sky, no Jared. It was just a screen now, playing the still image of the man he once was. Only he wasn't still. Every so often, the man on the bed twitched, slightly, like a marionette being tested before a show, and worse, Jared could feel it. A tug in his own limbs when the figure inside moved. Not full control. Not yet, but connected, tied. The camera in his hands clicked once on its own. No pressure, no trigger, just a soft metallic snap, like a cough in a quiet church. He looked down. A photograph began to slide from the slot. Slowly, like it didn't want to be born. The moment it landed in his hands, he knew what it was. Another first. It showed a room. Unfamiliar. Cold, sterile, almost like an office. Gray walls. No windows. In the center of the room, a child sat in a chair. Small, still. Around him stood 5 figures, faceless, only shadows, but with heads cocked toward him like birds watching something squirm. On the back of the photo were 3 words, stamped in red ink: Remplacement en process. And beneath it, scrawled in shaky handwriting, don't blink, don't breathe, don't break frame. Jared tried to drop the photo, but it stuck to his fingers like static cling. The more he struggled, the more the edges curled and bit into his skin like paper, thin blades. Blood welled at the tips of his fingers, soaking the edges. But still, it would not fall. Then, movement. The figure inside the room, his double, slowly turned its head to face the window. Jared's heart stopped. The copy stared at him now, through the glass, unblinking, mouth slightly open. Its hand moved to its lap and lifted something into view. Another camera, old, identical to Jared's. The figure raised it and clicked. Pain exploded in Jared's head, not physical pain, something deeper, a wrenching, tearing sensation, like his thoughts were being yanked backward through a funnel. His vision blurred. The photo in his hand burned cold, and when he looked down, the image had changed. It was no longer the office with the boy. Now it was him, standing exactly as he was, camera in hand, blood on his fingers. But this time, there was a figure behind him. Jared whirled around. There was no one there, only the white, still, buzzing. He turned back, and now the glass was gone, not shattered, not broken, gone. Where the window had been was now an open frame, room 6 waiting beyond it like a stage set, and inside his replacement still sat, camera in lap, watching, inviting. It smiled, then lifted one hand, and with 2 fingers beckoned him forward. Jared didn't move. He couldn't. Then the world outside began to shrink. The blank space tightened like a collapsing lung. The whiteness folded inward, drawing closer, erasing all sense of distance. The motel began to stretch and twist, like someone had grabbed the edges of the image and dragged it forward. He stepped through the frame. The moment he crossed, everything went silent, no hum, no breath, just stillness. And the camera, his camera, was gone. So was the photo. He was back in room 6, or a version of it. This one was even quieter than the last. Too perfect. No dust. No flicker in the light. He turned slowly, expecting the mirror to be cracked. It wasn't. It reflected everything as it should, almost. His reflection was smiling. He wasn't. The smile stayed even as he stepped away, even as his real face dropped into blank confusion. The image in the mirror held its grin like a wolf biding time. Then, as Jared approached, the reflection raised its hand and waved. The real Jared did not. Then came the whistle. Not from inside the room, not even from the mirror. From inside his own mouth. He hadn't opened it. He hadn't taken a breath, but the sound came anyway. 3 notes, a pause. 3 more. Clean, controlled. The reflection nodded and whispered a word that Jared felt more than heard. Initiated. The door to room 6 creaked open again. Jared turned toward it slowly, and on the other side was another child. Not the boy with the camera. A girl, maybe 8, with dark eyes and a stuffed animal clutched in her arms. She looked up at him without fear. "Only sadness. You're not real," she said. He tried to answer, but no words came. "I saw the picture," she continued. "You're not him anymore." Behind her, outside the door, were more rooms. Dozens of them. Hundreds. Motel doors stretching in every direction. A maze of repetition. And walking among them, men and women with Jared's face. Twisted. Reconfigured. Some missing mouths. Others with multiple sets of eyes. All of them carrying cameras. All of them smiling. The girl turned to run, and as she did, Jared stepped forward. But his body lagged. He was slower now, delayed. His thoughts distant. He tried to scream, but instead clicked. Another photo slid into his hand, though he hadn't touched a camera. It showed the girl, running. Blurred, and behind her him. But not quite him. His mouth was gone. His eyes were 2 lenses. The caption at the bottom read, "Rapia la CM at TMPEE." And finally, he understood room 6 was not a room. It was a lens. A processing station. A place between the human world and the archive. And once you've been developed, you're never the one behind the camera again. Jared no longer felt hunger, or thirst, or sleep pulling at the edges of his mind. Time had peeled away like old wallpaper, forgotten under the layers of what he was now. His feet moved of their own accord, carrying him through corridor after corridor of identical motel doors. Each one marked with the number 6, each one humming like a throat holding back a scream. He had tried to stop walking, but stopping wasn't allowed anymore. Every time he stood still, his bones would twitch, his breath would catch, and his fingers would begin to curl around something invisible. A shutter, maybe. A frame. Something waiting to click. The photograph of the girl still burned in his hand, warm and wet with his own sweat. Though the image had dried into permanence, she looked over her shoulder in the photo, eyes wide, mid-run, a blur of motion frozen too cleanly. Behind her, Jared's other face, the faceless version, stretched toward her with open arms. But the arms didn't belong to him. Not really. They belonged to the process. The same way the tune did. The same way the room did. The hallway turned suddenly, though he hadn't felt himself turn. There were no windows, no signs, and no change in the light overhead. But something was different now. The walls weren't mottled motel wallpaper anymore. They were smooth, white, clinical, sterile. Jared stopped before a door that didn't look like the others. This one was black, and instead of the number 6, it bore a brass plate with 3 words etched into it, smudged and crooked, as though it had been scratched on with a knife. THEIRHEAVRO. He didn't reach for the handle. He didn't need to. The door opened inward, sighing like a final breath. Inside was silence so thick it made his ears ring. The walls were lined floor to ceiling with photographs. Thousands, maybe millions. No labels. No order. Some were pinned with rusted tacks. Others were embedded into the wall itself, sinking slightly into the surface like wounds frozen mid-heel. He stepped in cautiously, the floor soft beneath him, not like carpet, but something porous. Like walking on film negatives soaked in old chemicals. As he moved deeper into the room, the air became heavier. Still images pressed in from all sides. Children caught mid-scream. Parents clutching doorways as figures loomed behind them. People in mirrors that didn't match the reflection. And everywhere, always, the watchers in the corners of the images. Shapes with Jared's face, or his mouth, or just his eyes. Like parts of him had been stolen and distributed among copies. In the center of the room stood a table. Atop it, a single projector. And beside it, a reel, labeled jarred, original. His hands reached before he could stop them. The reel was warm, alive. Humming faintly with breath, he placed it into the projector and turned it on. The hum rose. Then, flicker, the wall lit up, and Jared watched himself be born, screaming, pink, helpless. Then a flash, age 5, eyes wide, whistling in the backyard, age 10, alone in his room, watching something move under his bed, 15, camera in hand, smiling though not at anyone, 18, standing outside 47 Lockwood Lane. The reel sped up, jumping forward, motel room, mirrors. The static world, the click, then, now. The screen showed Jared standing where he stood, watching the film of himself. But this version had no eyes. Just black voids, with tiny camera lenses spinning in their centers. Jared stumbled back, but the screen kept playing. Now it was showing after, something he hadn't lived yet. He saw the girl from before. Running. Another motel. Another door. Another Jared standing behind it, hand on the knob. He was becoming the frame for someone else's fear. And the film was documenting every second. Then the reel clicked once more and began to rewind. Backward, fast, all the way to the beginning, back to the first child. Not Jared, not even human, just a shadow, whistling, alone in a room that didn't exist on any map. Click. A photo of that thing appeared on the wall. Jared turned and saw the same image, but with his face. Pinned beneath it, a plaque RP1 BACD original design. He backed away, heart racing. The images on the walls shifted, reordered themselves. Some turned upside down, others began to fade. His photograph, the one he carried, fluttered from his hand and pinned itself to the nearest wall. The caption changed to WATCHERRTRNINE, a status TABLE. Then the lights dimmed, and something began to descend from the ceiling. At first, it looked like rope, but as it lowered, he saw it wasn't rope at all. It was film. Thick, endless loops of it, twisted and damp, dropping in slow, slithering lines, curling around his shoulders, his arms, his neck. Rapping, recording, writing him. And above him, a voice, not loud, not menacing, just flat and factual, spoke from nowhere and everywhere. Subject 6 has entered the archive room. Designation active lens. Processing for duplication. Jared screamed. The film entered his mouth. Tangled in his throat, and in the dark, he saw the next photograph form on the wall before him. It showed a child in a bed, dreaming, and in the hallway beyond the door, a shadow long and thin holding a camera. Caption beneath NXTF RAME. Click. The next breath Jared took didn't feel like his own. It entered his lungs with too much precision, like it had been rehearsed, not lived. His chest rose and fell as the film unwound from his mouth, slithering back into the ceiling like a serpent that had fed well and was now retreating to digest. He collapsed to the floor of the archive room. Slick with sweat and something colder, not water, not blood, but the thick residue of memory. Like touching old photographs left too long in a flooded basement. His fingers dug into the soft floor, which pulsed faintly beneath him. It was alive. All of it. And it was remembering him now. The walls of the archive room had shifted. The photographs were no longer passive. They stared. Faces twisted subtly with each blink. Arms that had been raised in joy now reached for help, and in the silence that followed the voice, that awful, disembodied declaration of his new status, Jared heard a new sound, pages turning. He stood on shaky legs, every muscle stiff with the effort of reclaiming them. The sound came from a desk tucked into a corner he hadn't seen before. It hadn't been there when he entered, but that didn't matter anymore. Things appeared now. When they were needed. When the process dictated it. On the desk sat a thick book, no title on the spine, no markings on the cover. Just a faded cloth surface that smelled like old smoke and wet wood. Jared's hand hovered above it for a moment before he finally touched it. The pages turned on their own, stopping halfway through. There, etched in black ink across the yellowed page, was a single line, the watcher's role: observe. Record, replace. His stomach turned. The process wasn't random, it was documented, planned, and now codified. He flipped the page. Frames are chosen at the moment of stillness. A sketch beneath it showed a man sitting in a chair, staring at a television. The figure behind him had no face. Its hands hovered inches from the man's shoulders, camera lens embedded in each palm. The man in the chair didn't see it. Not yet. Next page. Once replacement is in progress, all external connections must be severed. Emotional imprints are the first to corrupt. Jared didn't need the diagram to understand. The image on that page showed a woman reaching for a child, her face warped in grief, her mouth open in an unheard scream. The figure between them had Jared's face. Smiling, he slammed the book shut, but it didn't stay closed. It fell open again, pages flapping until it reached the final section. This time in red, THUNFRAMABLE. His blood chilled. There was a list, names. Hundreds of them. Most had been crossed out in thick black strokes. A few remained untouched. At the bottom of the list, Rennet Ada. The librarian. The woman who'd tried to help him. The one who'd vanished. Next to her name, status breached, contained. He scanned the other names. Knox, Ethan, evaded, current whereabouts unknown. Blythe, Jonah, deconstructed. Thorne, Jared, replacement in final phase. Final phase. He stepped back from the desk like it had burned him. The book snapped shut this time, satisfied. And the room dimmed. A new wall slid open, not visibly, but with a quiet click like a page turning. Beyond it, darkness. Not empty, just waiting. He should have run. But running wasn't part of the manual. Jared stepped through the opening. The corridor was narrow and lined with shelves, but instead of books or photos, each shelf held bodies, wrapped in film, some alive, eyes twitching beneath layers, some long gone. They lined the path like an audience, silent witnesses to every step he took. And with each step, the air pressed heavier, thicker, full of the unseen. His breath echoed louder in his own ears. Then, at the end of the corridor, a screen, projecting nothing but white light. A silhouette stood before it, thin, still, head tilted, and next to it a camera on a tripod, already pointed, already focused. The figure turned. It was him. Not the replacement, not the static-eyed imitation, not the smiling thing. Him, the original, wide-eyed hawk. Mouth sewn shut with strips of black film. He shook as he raised one hand, held up a card. Jared stepped closer. On it were the words, "There is no exit, only inheritance." The original stepped aside, revealing a table behind him with a reel labeled THORNE Gerard. Final Parenti. Then the projector clicked. The image on the screen changed. It was the motel again. Room 6, the girl, running. And him, now standing in the hallway. Camera raised. Not fighting. Not hesitating. Participating. Jared tried to turn away, but his feet rooted to the floor. He was the last image on the reel now, and the film had run out of frames. Above him, the ceiling began to hum. From the corner, a machine stirred, blinking red, scanning the room. A final voice, smooth, indifferent, spoke overhead. Subject accepted. Archive updated. Watcher assigned. Jared felt it then, the last part. Not pain. Not fear. Permission. And somewhere in a real world he'd already forgotten, a camera clicked in a child's bedroom. A frame was chosen. A breath was held, and Jared stepped into his new role, a ghost in the lens. A flicker behind the curtain. Another watcher in the archive. Click. Somewhere far from the archive, in a town not yet marked on any map that mattered, a boy named Micah sat cross-legged on the floor of his bedroom. His fingers clutched a flashlight, the cone of light flicking from corner to corner like a nervous heartbeat. The power had gone out an hour ago. Maybe longer, and the silence of the house felt too wide now. Too aware, like the walls were listening. His parents weren't home. They'd gone to visit someone, an aunt, maybe, or a neighbor. The details felt slippery in his mind, like something had smudged the past few hours. All he knew for certain was that he was alone, and the light was dying. He hadn't moved in 20 minutes. Not since he heard it. A whistle. Not the wind. Not some rusted pipe settling. A whistle. 3 notes. A pause. 3 more. Low. Patient. Not musical. Intentional. And it hadn't come from outside the house. It had come from the hallway. Micah was only 9, but already smart enough to know some things don't ask for attention. They wait for it. They lurk in the corner of your eye and count your blinks. And when they know you're afraid, they whisper to the silence and make it familiar. The flashlight flickered again. He held his breath. A creak sounded outside his door. Not heavy, like someone had put their weight down wrong, but slow, careful. The kind of sound made by someone who doesn't want to be heard, but is too old not to make noise anymore. He turned off the flashlight. Darkness bloomed around him. Another whistle, closer now. Micah stared at the door, his eyes wide, pupils dilated, body locked in stillness. He didn't cry. He didn't move. Somewhere deep inside, some primal, silent instinct told him, don't acknowledge it. Don't make yourself real. The moment you do, it frames you. And then you're just another picture on the wall of a room you'll never leave. His eyes adjusted. In the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the window, he saw the photograph. It lay on the floor just inside his room. He hadn't noticed it before. Flat, glossy, black and white. He didn't move to touch it. Just stared. It showed a child's bedroom. His bedroom. Same bed. Same rug. Same half-drawn curtain. But in the photo, the room was empty, except for one thing. A man standing in the corner, too tall. Head bent sideways, like a branch that had grown wrong. His mouth was open, not screaming, not speaking, whistling. Micah's hand trembled as he turned on the flashlight again, praying it still had enough charge to show him that the corner of his room was empty. The beam lit up the far wall. The corner was bare. But the photograph had changed. He hadn't touched it. Now, the man was gone from the corner, and standing beside the bed. Micah didn't look. He focused on the floor, on his breath, on staying inside his body. The whistle came again, not from the hallway, from inside the room, right beside him. He didn't turn his head, and then footsteps, not loud, not heavy, but wet, like film being dragged across carpet. Something brushed his shoulder. Micah closed his eyes. Look at me, a voice whispered. Not angry, not loud, just eager. And from behind his eyelids something flashed. A shudder, he felt it. That stillness, the moment being captured. Only, the frame didn't settle. It hovered. Micah's breath caught in his throat. The voice whispered again, you're unframed. The words didn't make sense. But he understood them anyway. Something about him had resisted. He hadn't looked, hadn't acknowledged. He'd refused the image. The room shifted. The temperature dropped. The thing beside him, the watcher, the replacement, the thing that wore Jared's frame, trembled. Micah still didn't look. And then he spoke, voice low, but steady. You don't belong here. The silence that followed was electric. For a long moment, the room didn't breathe. And then, a noise, a tearing sound. Like celluloid ripped from a reel. Micah opened his eyes. He was alone. The photo on the floor had curled in on itself, blackened at the edges, and burned to ash without flame. The flashlight buzzed once, then clicked off. And the darkness, this time, was just darkness. Nothing lingered. No more whistling, no more figures. But as he crawled back into bed, trembling and pale, Micah couldn't help but wonder. Why didn't it take him? What was different? He didn't have an answer. But in the shadowy stretch of space beneath his bed, tucked behind a shoebox full of marbles and comic books, was a page from a manual, old, torn, smudged. On it, 3 lines remained legible. Unframed subjects are anomalies. Do not engage directly. Observe. Report. Archive separately. The Watcher hadn't failed. It had found something new. Something the archive hadn't prepared for. And far, far below, in the humming chambers of a machine made of memory and stillness, a red light blinked on. Anomaly detected. File open my CAH. Awaiting further frames. Click. Beneath everything, below the walls, the mirrors, the motel doors, the humming archive, there was a room that did not exist in blueprints. Blueprints that themselves didn't exist in any world, not already infected by the frame. It was a room even the Watchers didn't enter. No doors led to it. No corridors past it. It was summoned only when needed, and even then, only by the archive's most ancient rhythm, a pulse that signified something had broken the pattern. Inside that room, the air tasted metallic, not like blood, worse, like erased names. On the far wall, a monitor flickered to life. Not digital. Nothing in this place was. It buzzed with analog static, thick with distortion. Then the screen began to pulse. Slow, rhythmic flashes that didn't display pictures but presence. It was reading something. Processing. A voice crackled through the dust-choked speaker overhead. New anomaly confirmed. Designation Micah. Subject resisted frame assimilation. The voice wasn't human. Not in tone. Not in shape. It didn't speak so much as press the words into the air, letting them settle like ash. Across the room, a printer began to rumble. Not the modern kind, but the sort used for classified files in cold rooms, built with iron and coated in whispers. Paper fed through with grinding patience, and when it stopped, the file printed bore a header in thick red ink, Anamail file Yazolo1 Myketres. Beneath it, line after line of data began to generate. Age 9, origin unrecorded sector, exposure frame encounter. Class A, result frame rejection, emotional calibration neutral, visual contact denied, verbal resistance initiated, frame burn observed, memory reconfiguration, ineffective. A final note blinked at the bottom. Slower than the rest, as if hesitant to admit itself, status uncopyable. For the first time in centuries, the archive hesitated. The machine's gears shifted with uncertainty. Shelves of photographs rattled. Some images flickered between variations. People aging backwards and forwards, smiles becoming screams. Shadows deepening into shapes never meant to be seen. But all at once, they stopped. Micah had not looked. He had heard the whistle, had stood in its presence, had even been brushed by it, and still he had resisted. The system hadn't been designed for that. There was no protocol for denial of stillness. Somewhere, in one of the Watcher halls, Jared, now fully processed, fully absorbed, twitched. Not in thought. There was no thought left in him, but something deep within the stolen synapse of what he once was responded. A tremor, an echo, like a bell rung far away, a sound not heard but felt in the bones. The archive had no soul, but it remembered him. He had been the first to take too long. The first to watch instead of act. The first to feel the hesitation in his hand as he lifted the camera. Maybe it had started with him. Maybe it had always been broken. Inside room 6, a new photo developed, without being taken. It curled on the bed like a warning. Micah, sitting on the floor, flashlight in his lap, eyes closed. The moment before the whisper, before the Watcher had said, "Look at me," and at the bottom of the photo, in letters unlike any used before, "This frame refused us." No timestamp, no seal, no serial code. It didn't belong. The archive, for all its cold certainty, shivered. Then, with a loud mechanical gasp, another monitor flickered on in the depths below. A secondary file began to generate. This one bearing a different title, so RRPTO Maraneg Mica anomaly may cause recursive loop in watcher systems. Rappelsiementi incomplete. Ionophytium possible. The camera that had tried to frame him now lay on a table inside an abandoned room. Its lens cracked, its shutter stuck. It had never missed before. Now it trembled, and somewhere, back in the house Micah called home, the air was still. Too still. He lay in bed now, eyes open in the dark, staring at the ceiling. He hadn't told anyone. Couldn't. The words didn't make sense when he tried to say them. They tasted wrong in his mouth. But in his pocket was the torn edge of that manual page, the one that mentioned anomalies. He'd found it beneath the bed after the thing vanished. He didn't know how he understood it, only that he did. He was outside the frame, and they didn't know what to do with him. He didn't sleep, just blinked slowly, keeping count. Every few minutes, he'd sit up and glance at the corners of his room, the closet door, the window. He wasn't afraid. He was listening. Waiting. Because he knew something the archive hadn't realized yet. The watchers weren't the only ones who could observe. He could, too. Micah closed his eyes and in the silence began to hum. Not a whistle, just 3 soft notes. A pause, 3 more. And somewhere far beneath the archive, in a corridor lined with film that had never been viewed, a new reel started to develop on its own. No camera, no lens, no frame. Just a new name written in black ink, OBSRVR. Click, the archive had never been challenged before. It had been built on certainties, on silence, on stillness, on the sweet compliance of those who froze in fear when the watchers came. The system was old, older than memory, older than the first whistle ever heard by human ears. But in all its cold and careful existence, it had never accounted for someone looking back, for someone like Micah. A child who hadn't played by the rules, a subject who had resisted the frame not by fighting, but by denying its very shape, by refusing to become still. And now it was breaking, deep in the lowest levels, where rows of watchers hung like bats in dreamless hibernation. One of them began to twitch. The movement was small at first, a spasm of the hand, a flutter behind sealed lids. But in the archive's code, even the smallest anomaly echoed like a scream. It registered as a warning, a flaw, and flaws had to be corrected. But this one couldn't be, because this watcher wasn't reacting to input. It was responding to Micah. Back in the quiet dark of his bedroom, Micah lay still, but not in fear. His eyes were open, unblinking. He was listening. Beneath the hush of night, beneath the breath of trees, and the distant hum of transformers, there was another sound. Quieter than wind, slower than breath. Observation. Something watched him now, but not from the corner, not from the closet or the ceiling. From elsewhere. From that inn, between place where the archive nested, where thought was recorded but not born. He could feel it. But he didn't look away. He looked directly at it, and in that moment, something fractured, not in his world, in theirs. Inside the archive, the file labeled OBSRVR began duplicating, over and over, uncontrolled. Each copy slightly different. Lines of redacted data filled the monitors, code failing to contain a designation never meant to exist. Micah Reese class undefined. Frame status inverted. Observation direction B, directional. Replacement denied. In the white halls where watchers stood frozen until summoned, several began to stir, reacting to no command. They shifted not toward new targets, but away from one. Micah had become something foreign. Not a threat, not yet, but worse, unpredictable. He wasn't running. He wasn't hiding. He was watching them back. The moment he had stared into the presence without acknowledging its shape, the dynamic changed. He didn't freeze. He registered. And now the frame could not contain him. The room around Micah remained dim and silent, but the silence was no longer absolute. There was tension in it. Strain. Like stretched film just before it snaps. He felt it in his chest. Not like fear, but awareness. He knew he had been filed, tagged, observed. But now the lens was fogging, and in a quiet, Mechanical chamber, hundreds of layers beneath reality. A machine that had not moved in centuries creaked to life. Not by command. By instinct. A protocol no longer used. A dead switch reactivated by paradox. Archi or Ferainentited, CONTR Frem Rakuat Irided, a Caesar Android file. The red file. It was legend among watchers. Whispers passed between corridors. A file so dangerous it had been locked inside a frame within a frame, buried in static deeper than any living memory could access. No watcher had ever seen it. No archive worker had ever spoken its name aloud, because it contained what the archive feared most, a subject not merely unframed, but reflective. Micah. He wasn't a mistake. He was a mirror. And the archive had looked into him for too long. Now it saw itself, and it recoiled. Inside room 6, one of the thousands scattered across the fold, a new figure emerged from the mirror. It did not walk. It didn't glide. It became a shape half-born, built of memory and light, face flickering between familiar features. Jared, Ada, the boy, even Micah. It had no fixed shape because it was not a watcher. It was a reply. Micah had not struck out, not summoned power, not broken any device. He had simply refused to collapse into stillness. He had held the archive's gaze and waited for it to blink. And now, something was blinking. The new figure walked down the motel hallway, doors all labeled 6, each one whispering its own version of the whistle. Behind the figure, film peeled from the walls, falling to the floor like dead snakes. Images melted. Frames reversed. The past began to fold into the present, refusing to lie still. Watchers turned, sensing it. Some reached for cameras. None lifted them. The figure didn't acknowledge them. It passed by each one like a tide ignoring stones. Because this wasn't vengeance. This wasn't violence. It was correction. Micah stirred in his bed, eyes narrowing as a thought bloomed inside him, not like a child's curiosity, but like instinct. Deep. Carved into him from the first moment he had refused the whistle. He understood now. He wasn't part of the archive. He was the glitch that kept it from becoming complete. And as he lay back, closing his eyes with calm, for the first time in days, the lights in his room dimmed, not from power failure, but from acknowledgement. He was being left alone, feared, and deep below, the archive, for the first time since it was born, closed a file not out of completion, but out of respect. Absr VR a CTIV. Fardir Framesa Abarartid. Respas Defarardid. And on a desk in an unseen room, a blank photo developed on its own. Just light, no subject, no caption. Only a smear of static and one faint line, etched in crooked ink. He looked back. Click. Somewhere inside the endless archive, in the deepest core, where memory hardened into law, and time wrapped itself into repeating patterns, a lens shut. Not shattered. Not broken. Just closed, quietly. The system logged the event, but no alarm was triggered. No response team dispatched. Because the archive didn't know how to respond. It had no language for retreat. Its entire purpose was preservation, capturing moments, stilling movement, fixing life inside perfect frames. And yet now one of its eyes had gone blind, voluntarily, because of a boy who had looked. Not with anger, not with magic, not with tools. Just awareness. He hadn't frozen, hadn't accepted the shape of his fear, and in doing so, he'd become something the archive couldn't categorize. It had tried. Micah had a file, a designation, even a protocol ready to engage. But nothing fit. He had not followed the rules of the hunted, nor acted like prey. He had seen the mechanism behind the curtain and simply refused to enter the frame. So the lens closed. Back in room 6, silence reigned. True silence this time. Not the rehearsed hush of a room waiting for someone to become afraid, but a deeper quiet, the kind that settles after something ends. The chair sat untouched, the bed unwrinkled, the mirror no longer fogged. No photographs drifted down, no whispers echoed behind the walls. The frame had nothing left to offer. Its process had paused. Outside of that room, in the gray corridors, where watchers once floated in dreamless waiting, a different stillness had crept in. Not the kind they created, the kind they feared, the kind born not from lack of motion, but from resistance to it. Watchers began to drift, aimless, disconnected. Without a frame to complete, they began to unravel. Their shapes blurred, some shrank, others expanded, losing detail like figures sketched in charcoal and left in the rain. They had never needed purpose before. It had always been assigned. But with Micah, the script had broken. The cue had been missed, he had not played his part, and now neither could they. In one room, Room 6, Sector A, the Jared replica sat on the edge of the bed, camera in lap, mouth agape. But no breath passed through it. His eyes stared forward, no longer glowing, no longer reflective. Just glass now, dead and cold. He hadn't moved in hours, not since the last file closed. The command to observe had not returned. The archive had not issued new names. He had become the very thing the archive feared most, useless. Meanwhile, in a suburban house no one remembered building, a child sat at his desk drawing. Micah's pencil moved slowly, not sketching monsters or ghosts, but diagrams, circles, lines, notebooks full of strange equations, none of them taught in any school, none of them legible to anyone else. But he understood them. He wasn't drawing pictures. He was drawing patterns, loops, frames, the things that trapped moments and made them behave. He was building a map, not of the world, of the archive. Every night, he added a little more. A door here, a window there, a corridor that shouldn't exist. Places he'd never seen but somehow remembered. He didn't know how. He only knew they were real. And with each drawing, he felt something shifting. Not around him, inside him. A part of him could see them now. The watchers who hovered outside homes, cameras quivering, unsure whether to enter. The lenses that blinked once, then faded. The shapes that turned away. They hadn't stopped hunting others, just him. He had become a cautionary tale, a rupture, a flaw in their film. One night, while drawing, he paused mid-sketch. The pencil stopped on the page, because he felt it. Not like before, not hostile, not watching, waiting. He looked up and saw her. A girl, maybe 10, standing in the corner of his room, hair damp, pajamas torn, eyes wide but not afraid. She didn't speak. She simply held out a photograph. Micah stood and took it. It was her, asleep, in her bed, and outside her window, a watcher, camera raised. Frozen. She looked at him with a silent question. Micah nodded once. She vanished, but the photo remained. Later, he added a new section to his drawing, a narrow hallway, a second chair, another screen, and beneath it, a name. Not his, hers. He didn't know her story, but he understood her role. She had refused the frame too. She had seen him, and that meant something new had begun. Not resistance, not war, observation, not of victims, of the watchers. The archive, built on the idea that no one ever looked back, now trembled beneath the weight of children who had learned to stare. And in its endless halls of stillness, a ripple formed. A warning the system didn't know how to write. A caption beneath a developing photo with no face yet printed. There will be more. Click. They came slowly at first, one by one, quiet as secrets. Some arrived in whispers, others in dreams they couldn't fully remember. But they all felt it. That unmistakable sense that something had watched them from the edges of their sleep, from the corner of a mirror, from the fuzzed out edge of a photograph taken too late at night. And like Micah, they had refused. Not loudly, not with defiance, but with something far more dangerous awareness. They didn't scream. They didn't hide under beds or run to their parents. They simply stared back, and the archive shuddered. Across towns and cities that never knew their names were written inside rooms that never existed on any map. The silence began to splinter. A watcher would arrive, called by instinct, protocol, or something older, and it would freeze before completing its task. Its camera would raise, shutter trembling, but the moment it aligned with a child's face, it would fail to click. Not because the subject moved, because the subject was already watching. These children weren't tethered to the rules. They didn't succumb to stillness. Something had changed in them. Something passed from Micah not through words or instructions, but through a ripple, a frequency that couldn't be measured or documented, a refusal woven into the bones. And the archive had no defense. One watcher stopped mid-process, its body, long and faceless, folded in on itself and simply dissolved. Like a film strip exposed to too much light, it hadn't been defeated. It had been rendered obsolete. Another one, trapped inside the mirror of a child's bathroom, found itself unable to move as the girl on the other side watched it and asked softly, "Do you know what you are?" It didn't. It had never needed to know. It had only needed to obey. Now, obedience was no longer enough. Some watchers broke entirely, collapsing into static before their camera lens could open. Some ran, not visibly, not with feet or breath, but they retreated, crawling back into the dark corners of the archive to escape the gaze that didn't blink. Because to be seen was to be made real. And the archive had survived by staying unseen, by living in suggestion, in the fear of corners, in the unknown. The children were changing that. Micah felt it growing every night. Not power, not control, but presence. When he closed his eyes now, he saw lines that didn't belong to this world. Cross-sections of places buried behind reflections. Flickers of trapped faces waiting to be remembered. And always the pull of something deeper. A truth the archive had tried to keep buried in rooms, with no names and files, with no tops or bottoms. They weren't just resisting the watchers. They were uncovering the purpose behind them. One night, he woke to find his drawing desk glowing faintly. Not with light, with movement. The pages of his notebooks shuffled themselves, rearranging their sketches until the map began to take on a new shape. Not corridors or frames or halls of endless doors. A circle, a perfect circle. Every sector of the archive, every room 6, every watcher path, all orbiting a single, untouched center. A room with no key, no door, no name, and beneath the shape, a phrase had written itself in Micah's jagged handwriting, though he didn't remember writing it. The original frame. Something was there. Something older than the archive. Something it had been built around. The next morning, he wasn't alone. He stepped outside into the backyard where the grass was still damp and cool underfoot, and found a boy waiting near the fence. Younger than him, eyes too wide. In his hands was a Polaroid. He didn't speak, just held it out. Micah took it. The photo showed a darkened room, not a home, not a motel, a circle of children, all facing inward, eyes closed, holding hands, and in the center, a shape, blurry and pulsing with something unreadable. A shadow that wasn't cast by light, a thing being remembered. Micah looked up. The boy was gone. But the photo remained. He pinned it above his desk and added a new line to the circle in his drawings. A path no watcher had ever walked. A road only children could follow. That night, he dreamed of the girl again. The one who had appeared in his room. She stood at the mouth of a tunnel with walls that blinked and sighed like lungs. Behind her, more children waited. Boys and girls of every age, all with eyes like his. Knowing. She nodded, and Micah stepped forward. He didn't flinch when the film wrapped around his legs. He didn't look away when the whispers began. He walked deeper into the dark and felt no fear. Because the archive no longer owned the dark. The children did. And in a forgotten hall, far beneath the central processor of stillness, a new file began to form. It did not come from a watcher's lens. It came from inside the system. Etched in jagged red across its title, OBSERVD. Caption beneath, the lens has been reversed. Click. The archive was no longer silent. It made no sound, but it wasn't silent. The kind of noise it gave off now had no pitch, no shape, no frequency, only pressure. A constant, nauseating sense of presence leaking through the framework like oil through a paper wall. Systems blinked erratically. Files refused to settle. Entire sectors looped indefinitely, replaying the same fragments over and over as if trying to correct themselves. But correction required a reference point, and that point, the center, was waking up. Deep beneath the network of rooms 6, beneath the stacked layers of watcher corridors and memory vaults, a pulse had begun. No alarms had triggered. No protocols initiated. Because this place wasn't wired into the archive. It was the thing the archive was built around. A center with no door. A memory too large to be stored, too wild to be framed. And now, it was bleeding through the structure. Not fast, not loud. Just enough to be felt by the ones who knew how to look. Micah had felt it for weeks. It hummed through his drawings, coiled in the shapes of his dreams. It whispered behind the eyes of every watcher he passed. He didn't run from them anymore. He moved among them. Their lenses dimmed at his presence. Their frames refused to take. He was still an anomaly to the archive, but to the watchers, he had become something closer to a question they were no longer allowed to ask, and that question was guiding him. The circle had narrowed. The children were gathering, some from towns where the sky flickered wrong, others from homes with rooms that no longer opened. All of them had heard the whistle. All of them had been given their moment to be captured. None of them were. Micah stood at the edge of the map now. His map. The one that had started as scribbles, that had slowly grown into something far older than him. A design made of recursion and echo, a spiral of observation, a loop of mirrors, and at the core, something different. A hollow that was never meant to be seen. That was where he was going. That was where it waited. He stepped through his backyard in the early hours before dawn, where the air was still and wet with silence, and felt the pull. Not forward. Down. Not physical either. There was no door to find, no stairwell or passage, only a point in the world where things began to tilt, where the rules started to dissolve. He crossed into it by accident. One blink he was outside, the next, below. No transition, no shift, just arrival. The space wasn't a room. It was a memory of one. Walls hinted themselves into shape, constantly flickering between substance and shadow. The floor felt solid until he tried to look at it directly, and the ceiling it breathed. In the center was a chair, small, wooden, occupied. Micah approached carefully, the way one approaches a wild animal that isn't quite awake. The figure in the chair was a child. Not alive, not dead, still, but not framed, and that was worse. Because the archive had tried. Dozens of photographs hung in the air around him like floating leaves, all of them the same. All of them failing. The boy was never centered, his face always blurred, his outline always drifting, the original frame. The first subject, the one that couldn't be captured. And so, the archive had built itself around him. A containment system disguised as an observation network, a prison made of silence. And now Micah was inside it. He moved closer, and the boy's eyes opened. They were glassy and vacant, but not unaware. They had seen too much. "Are you him?" Micah asked, softly. The boy didn't answer. But something behind the walls of the room shifted. A photograph developed in mid-air. Micah caught it. It showed the two of them, standing across from each other within this impossible space, and in the background, the archive. Blurring, fraying, melting. The caption on the photo was unfinished. Just one word typed in red observer. Before it could complete, the photo dissolved in his hands like ash. Micah turned back to the boy in the chair, but he was gone. The chair, gone. The room, unraveling. It had no choice now. He had made it observable. The archive had been built to avoid this moment. It was never about collecting memories. Never about preserving time. It was about holding something still long enough to forget it existed. But the children had remembered. Not all of them. Just enough. And now the center had been seen. Across the system, watchers convulsed. Lenses shattered from within. Photos curled and burned. Rooms collapsed into static. The manual began rewriting itself, pages blanking out as the rules lost their grip. Room 6 blinked off the grid one by one. And in the newly forming space, where the archive had once lived, Micah stood alone, holding no camera, speaking no words. He didn't need to. He had found the thing they tried to hide, and he had looked straight at it. That was enough. The room blinked once, and was gone. The archive closed its final lens. Click. When the archive vanished, it didn't disappear in a grand collapse or apocalyptic roar. There was no explosion, no blinding light. It simply stopped being where it had always been. And yet, something remained. A texture in the air, a thickness behind mirrors, a kind of noise that wasn't heard but felt. Not sound, but static. A fine, persistent hum, like the aftermath of a dream too vivid to forget, but too strange to recall. People noticed first in the way their homes felt larger, like the walls had been pulled back, like breath flowed easier. Mirrors no longer flickered when no one was watching. Cameras stopped glitching, and photographs, old ones tucked in drawers, albums, attic boxes, began to change. Not dramatically, no obvious horrors, just subtle details, a background figure missing, a familiar hallway now bare. Smiles that didn't quite reach the eyes. The edits weren't malicious. They were restorative. As if the memories were being returned to their original shape. But in some places, the static held on. Micah knew it hadn't truly ended. The archive was too old, too wide, too deeply rooted in the folds of memory and perception to be killed. What had collapsed was only the structure, the visible part, the network, the maze, the image. But the core, the force that birthed it, still clung to the cracks in the world. It had become passive again, dormant, watching the watchers. Some children still felt it. The ones who had looked back, who had once been chosen to be framed, but had refused to sit still, now moved through the world with an unspoken understanding. They didn't speak of what had happened. They didn't need to. There was a recognition in their glances, like people who shared a dream they knew wasn't only a dream. Micah wandered now. He didn't return to school. He didn't age like the others did. Not visibly. People who saw him twice swore he looked younger the second time, or older, depending on who you asked. He was a blur in passing conversations, a story told among children about the boy who could see through cameras, who could stop a shadow just by turning toward it. He didn't deny any of it. He walked the edge of the still places, the places the archive had once touched. Motels with missing rooms, libraries with unmarked doors, houses that smelled faintly of undeveloped film and stale breath. And in each place, he left something behind. A drawing, a torn photo, a note in a forgotten language only other children could understand. He was reminding the world to remember. Because that was the archive's secret all along. It didn't feed on moments. It fed on forgetting. The stillness, the silence. The frame, it wasn't about trapping people in memories. It was about removing them from the world. Erasing presence. Replacing it with something quiet, obedient, false. Now the world was noisy again, sometimes dangerously so. But it was real, and the static remembered. There were still places where it gathered. Empty buildings where lights flickered in patterns. Long abandoned theaters where reels played films no one remembered making. Forest clearings where cameras hung from trees like warning signs. In those places, if you stood too long, you'd feel it. That pull, that whisper, the frame trying to rebuild itself. It wouldn't stop completely. Because what the archive was couldn't be undone. It could only be resisted. Micah had learned that. So had the others. And resistance, they found, was easier when you weren't alone. So the children stayed in touch. Not through phones or texts or letters, but in the spaces between things. A drawing scratched into a park bench. A reflection in a storefront that didn't match the angle. A Polaroid pinned to a school hallway corkboard that no one remembered taking. Each one a message. Each one a signal. We're still here. We're still watching. One day, Micah returned to the motel. It was gone. Not demolished, gone. In its place, an empty field. But he could still feel the outline of the building. Could still hear the humming in the soil. The memory of the archive lingered here stronger than anywhere else. This had been a nest, a stronghold, a birthplace. But now it was just space. He took out the final photo he'd kept. It was blank, no subject, no date, just that white gloss and a silence thicker than anything the camera had captured. And on the back, in faint pencil scrawl, "If they come again, don't blink." He tucked it into the dirt, not buried, just placed, a marker, for what might be again. Then he turned and walked away. Behind him, the wind carried a soft hiss through the grass, static, watching, waiting. But for now, the lens stayed shut. Click. The archive had folded, but like all things that dissolve into memory, its end was not an erasure, it was a fracture. A split in the shape of the world. One that didn't bleed or scream, but shifted, slightly, permanently. A crack no one could point to, but that people could feel in the same way they sensed someone staring from behind glass, even when the window was black. The children, those who had stared back, weren't the same anymore. They laughed, they played, they lived. But beneath their skin ran something else now, not power, not poison. Exposure. They had seen the edge of a system meant to erase them. They had felt the stillness reach for them, and had stepped outside it. That leaves a mark, whether you survive or not. Whether you remember or try to forget. And not all of them remembered the same way. Some began drawing doors they'd never walked through. Others hummed the tune of the whistle without knowing where they'd heard it. A few sleepwalked into the woods and stood in silence for hours before waking with tear-streaked faces and no memory of what they'd seen. They weren't being hunted, not yet, but something was watching them from the fracture. It was a different kind of presence now. Subtler, less structured. What remained of the archive was no longer a machine, no longer governed by rooms and protocols and cameras. It had leaked into the world, and it was learning, adapting. Like smoke finding new cracks, it no longer waited for permission. It studied, mimicked, slipped between cracks in language and meaning. It wasn't trying to rebuild itself yet. It was trying to understand why it had failed, why the children had resisted, why the stillness hadn't held. And to understand, it needed new frames, not of people, of moments, snapshots of contradiction, of resistance, of movement that refused to be simplified. And those moments, the anomalies, they started happening more frequently. A teacher in Maine stepped into her classroom to find her students all holding hands, eyes closed, chanting a rhyme no one had taught them. A security guard in New Mexico reviewed surveillance footage only to watch himself disappear from frame halfway through his shift. But remember being there the entire time. A woman in Pennsylvania received a voicemail from her deceased brother. It was just static, but she heard her name in it. Twice. The fracture wasn't hunting. It was remembering. And from that remembering, a new shape began to form. Not a central archive, not a tower of lenses and dark corridors. This was softer, smarter. It was interested in stories now, in how things unraveled, not just how they were stored. It was listening for the moments that didn't make sense, that wouldn't stay still. That blood, and Micah knew. He could feel it crawling back, not as a threat, not yet, but as a curiosity. He had become a myth in the background. Some adults whispered about the boy who could walk between frames, who made cameras short-circuit just by looking into them. They never saw him, but they all knew someone who had. A kid who claimed he spoke in their dreams. A nurse who found a drawing under her desk with Micah's name scribbled in the corner. Except the child she'd treated hadn't been named Micah. He was planting seeds, messages, warnings, because the fracture wasn't finished. It had only shifted form. One night, in a vacant bus station outside a long-forgotten town, Micah sat on a bench beneath a flickering light. He was waiting, not for a ride, not for rescue. Just waiting. The way you wait for something you already know is coming. In his lap was a Polaroid, fresh, undeveloped. He hadn't taken it. It had appeared in his backpack that morning, cold to the touch. He hadn't looked at it yet. He was saving that moment. Around him, the air was too still. Not dangerous, just wrong. Like the world had held its breath, he felt eyes, not from the shadows, not from people, but from the space between the seconds. Like something in time itself had turned toward him. And then, without warning, the photo developed, in reverse. First the caption, then the blur, then the shapes. It showed him sitting on the bench just as he was. But behind him, in the reflection of the bus station glass, a figure stood, tall, bent, camera raised, watching. Micah didn't turn around. He didn't need to. He simply placed the photo beside him and whispered, "I see you." The lights flickered, not violently, just enough to let him know it had hurt. It wasn't over. The archive was gone, but the fracture wasn't. And in the coming days, others would begin to feel it, too. The cold air that didn't belong. The mirror that twitched even when they stood still. The photo that took itself. The whisper that always came just after a blink. And somewhere, beneath it all, a single note repeated itself in a fading hum. Click. Pause. Click. And then the silence again. Not of safety, but of a lens adjusting its focus. It began with reflections. Not mirrors cracking or breaking, no. That would have been too loud, too theatrical. Instead, they lagged, just enough to notice. Just enough to make someone turn their head and wonder if they'd actually seen it. You'd raise your hand, and your reflection would hesitate for the briefest moment before following. You'd tilt your head, and your mirrored self would stare just a second too long. Not wrong, just out of sync. Most people brushed it off. Sleep deprivation. Stress. Trick of the light. They looked away and didn't think about it again. But for those who had been touched by the archive, those who had stood at the edge of stillness and not succumbed, it wasn't a trick. It was a warning. The fracture had found a new shape to press through mirrors. Micah knew before the first stories reached him. He'd seen it in the static that clung to the corners of his reflection for weeks. His own eyes, staring back at him with thoughts he hadn't had yet. The slow, deliberate way his double blinked, like it was memorizing the motion. It didn't scare him. Nothing really did anymore. But he respected it. The archive was reassembling, not through machines or corridors or watchers, but through mimicry. Reflection is observation. Observation is memory. Memory is control. One girl in Nevada found her bathroom mirror fogging from the outside. It didn't matter if she took cold showers. Every time she stepped inside, the mirror was already blurred, as though someone had been standing there before her. One night, she wiped it, and instead of her own face, saw a boy she didn't recognize. His mouth was open, but no sound came out. She covered the mirror with a towel. The next morning, the towel was gone. The mirror was clean, and her toothbrush was wet. Another boy in Oregon threw a rock at his hallway mirror after it started showing him sleeping when he was wide awake. The glass didn't break. It bent, like water, and the reflection smiled before vanishing. The stories spread fast among the children. Not on the internet. There were no videos, no viral posts. This was deeper, quieter, like a rumor embedded into dreams. They knew the rules: don't run, don't blink, and don't accept the version of yourself that stares too long. Micah kept moving. He visited a school where every classroom had its mirrors covered in duct tape. A teacher had seen something in the reflection of a child. Something too tall, too quiet, something that copied movements before they happened. She never came back after that. The substitute never asked why. In an abandoned motel bathroom, a place he didn't expect to still exist, Micah faced a mirror that refused to reflect anything at all. He stood in front of it for nearly an hour, unmoving, watching nothing watch him back. Then he reached out and touched only air. No glass. No resistance. Just open space dressed like a mirror. He stepped through, and that was when he saw them. The not-quite versions. Children caught mid-blink, faces half sketched. Some moved backwards, replaying moments in jerky loops. Others hovered, suspended between poses like paper dolls, waiting for hands to arrange them. These weren't memories. They weren't ghosts. They were drafts. The archive was trying to redraw what it had lost. It didn't want to steal anymore. It wanted to recreate. But it didn't understand how. So it watched. It mirrored. It practiced. These spaces weren't rooms anymore. They were stages. Each mirror was a stage. Each reflection, a rehearsal. Micah walked between them, the hum of observation crawling beneath his skin. One of the reflections turned its head toward him. Despite its body remaining locked in a sideways stance, it opened its mouth and hissed. Not a word, not a breath, but a shudder. A mechanical mimic of a camera click. And then came the whisper. Not spoken. Printed. Across the surface of the mirror behind him. Like breath on cold glass returned to frame. Micah shook his head. No, he said quietly, and the mirror shattered. Not into shards, but into images. Thousands of them. Frozen moments. Half-formed scenes. Laughter that never reached ears. Screams that never reached lungs. They burst outward and dissolved in the air like mist. He'd rejected the frame again. But now it was adapting faster. He couldn't just resist. He had to warn. Outside the mirror space, the world felt brittle, like time was bending slightly, favoring stillness. Micah began carving signs where he could. Chalk outlines on brick, smudges on reflective glass, sigils etched into the frost of school windows. Messages for those who'd see them. For the ones who were starting to wake up. Because the more the archive fractured, the more it sought replacements, and mirrors. Mirrors were everywhere. It didn't need watchers anymore. It had us. Every reflective surface became a potential script, a test scene, a casting call for control. Micah's drawings changed again. No longer corridors or circles. Now he sketched faces, half-formed, off-kilter. Some were too familiar. One of them looked like his mother, but her eyes were looking up instead of forward. Another was himself, but younger, with a cracked smile. He pinned them to the walls of abandoned places, left them where only the right eyes would find them. He was creating a map of the wrong reflections. And somewhere, deep inside the fracture, the archive tried to copy him. It traced the faces, built new drafts, but none of them held. None of them looked back, and that was its failure. That was the one thing it couldn't steal. Because to truly mimic someone, you have to understand them, and the archive could only ever watch. Micah smiled at his reflection the next morning. It didn't smile back. He wiped the mirror clean with the sleeve of his shirt and whispered into the glass, still trying The reflection tilted its head, but did not respond. Somewhere across the world, another mirror blinked and didn't return. Click. By the time the first mirror cracked on its own, Micah was already moving again. Not running, just moving, like a current. He followed signs that weren't meant to be seen. Uneven shadows at noon, reflections that showed places you hadn't been, whispers that stayed in your ears long after sound should have faded. The world had changed. It looked the same. Trees still swayed, cities still buzzed, children still laughed in schoolyards. But beneath it all, there was tension, like a pulled wire, something deep and ready to snap. The fracture hadn't sealed, it had deepened. And the archive, what was left of it, had found new ways to enter. Not through cameras, not through frames or files, but through memory itself. It began with dreams. Children waking with blood at their noses, unable to explain why they remembered events that hadn't happened. Entire families forgetting what day it was. Teachers repeating the same lesson 3 days in a row with no awareness they'd already taught it. The past was stuttering, slipping. The archive wasn't just watching now, it was rewriting. Micah found a boy in a small coastal town whose voice didn't match his own. It was deeper, older. His parents insisted he'd always sounded that way, but the neighbors disagreed. His baby photos showed a scar on his cheek he didn't have anymore. He remembered falling off his bike. The bike, his parents swore, had never existed. But Micah believed him, because the boy's shadow was delayed, following just slightly behind his steps. The archive was trying to repair itself using memories as stitching. But it didn't know how to thread emotion. And that made the seams show. Micah stayed with the boy for 3 days, helping him redraw his memory on paper. Together, they mapped it out. Real events, false ones, places that bled into each other. And in the final drawing, they noticed a dark line running through everything. Not a path. A cut. As if someone had tried to excise part of his life with a blade. And at the center of that cut, barely visible under layers of graphite and ink, was the symbol, the frame, a perfect square, broken on one corner. It wasn't dead, it was wounded. And like anything that bled, it wanted to heal. Micah knew what that meant. It wouldn't come quietly anymore. The next child he found was already caught in it. A girl who hadn't spoken in weeks. Her eyes were distant, locked on things others couldn't see. But in her drawings, frantic scrawls in red ink, was a pattern. Faces without mouths. Rooms with no exits. People standing in corners, all facing the same wall. In the middle of every picture a door, closed, covered in film, and above it, the phrase "Dau not develop." She had dreamed of a place where memories screamed, where stillness bled through the air like fog, where everything you forgot was still alive, pacing just behind the walls. Micah didn't question her. He only asked one thing: "Can you draw what's behind the door?" She shook her head. "It draws me." That night, the door appeared in Micah's dream for the first time. It wasn't like the other dreams, the ones the archive used to lure and catalog. This was colder, deeper. There was no narrative, no whispering, just the door, covered in a thick black sheet of photo film, unprocessed and humming. It wasn't locked. It didn't need to be. Because the second you wanted to open it, it already knew. He woke up choking on the scent of darkroom chemicals. His hands were stained with invisible ink. The archive was using the fracture not to rebuild itself, but to become something new. Not a watcher, a framer. It had learned that cameras could be broken, mirrors could be ignored, watchers could be escaped. But memories could frame you from the inside. And once they did, they bled into everything else. Micah began to notice the shift in others. Children who'd never faced a watcher, but now flinched at their own reflections. Adults who'd never heard of Room 6, but muttered the number in their sleep. The fracture had gone viral. Not like a disease, but like a myth. Self-replicating, infecting not with symptoms, but with stories. A girl in the South drew a picture of a hallway she'd never walked, with walls made of whispers. A boy on the coast built a diorama of a motel room with 2 chairs facing a broken mirror. They were remembering things they had never lived, which meant the archive had stopped waiting for consent. It had started inserting. Every memory forgotten too quickly, every déjà vu too sharp, every scar you couldn't recall earning, it was reaching in. Trying to set a new frame, trying to bind reality again, not with watchers, but with the lies people tell themselves to stay sane. And those lies, they bled. Micah understood what he had to do. He had to find the original memory, the first one the archive ever stole, the one it had built itself around, the one it buried in so many layers of silence and mimicry that not even it could remember what it was. Because if he could find it, he could open the door. And if he could open the door, maybe they could end it. Really end it. But to do that, he'd have to go deeper than memory. He'd have to forget himself. And in the final drawing he made that night, a spiral turning inward into a single black dot, he wrote one word beneath it: blood remembers. Click. It took Micah weeks to reach it, though not by distance. The place wasn't on any map. It didn't sit beneath a sky or above a road. It lived somewhere between forgetting and being forgotten. A blind spot in memory. And the closer he got, the more it pulled him inward, folding time like paper, bleeding days into nights and nights into things that felt like neither. He slept less, or maybe more. His body no longer responded to clocks. Shadows stretched longer around him. Reflections blinked without mirrors. And always, there was the whisper of film, flapping gently in a wind that didn't exist. The place was called Room Zero, not by signage or nameplate. There was none. But Micah knew it. In the same way you know your own breath in the dark. A room so still it had stopped being a location and become something else. A scar, a preserved tear in whatever stitched the world together. The first, the source, the original frame. It wasn't locked, but it hadn't been opened in a very long time. The door looked like nothing. No knob, no handle. Just a gray slab where a hallway ended. He stood before it with his palms open, heart steady. He didn't knock. He didn't speak. He simply remembered, and the door melted. Not physically, not all at once. It softened in layers, as if time was being peeled off of it. And behind it, nothing. Not a room. Not a space. Just darkness. Not the absence of light, but the absence of being seen. This place didn't want to be looked at, and that's why he stepped inside. Instantly, he forgot. His name, his age. Why he'd come. It all slipped from him like water through fingers. But not in panic. In peace. The room required forgetting. It demanded it. Because memory was how the archive tracked you. How it laced itself into your story. And in Room Zero, there was no story. Only what remained when stories were stripped away. He didn't move. The space moved around him, breathing, slow, patient, waiting. Then something took shape. A chair, not empty. A boy sat there, thin, still. His face familiar. Not just to Micah, but to something deeper inside him. Like seeing a version of a thought you'd never dared put into words. The boy looked up. He did not blink. "You came back," he said. Micah didn't respond. He didn't need to. There was no distance between them. They weren't two people. Not anymore. The boy smiled, a slow, sad curve of the mouth that held 1,000 broken echoes. "You were the first to leave. The first to turn around. Do you know what that did to it?" Micah tried to ask what he meant, but no words came. The room didn't allow sound, only shape. The boy stood. As he did, images flowed from his skin like steam. Photographs, faces, mirrors, doors. All versions. All drafts. The archive had built itself not to contain him, but to copy him. To recreate that one perfect moment. The stillness he once gave it. "But I blinked," the boy whispered. That was the sin. The origin. In that moment of imperfection, the archive became hungry. Desperate. It began chasing the shape of a stillness it could never truly possess. It built corridors, watchers, reflections. All to recapture that instant. Micah stepped closer. "You're not me," he said. "I'm what you were," the boy said. "Before you looked back. Before you resisted." The boy raised a hand. Micah raised his. They touched, and Room Zero remembered him. It pulsed, hard enough to shake the silence into sound. Images flashed, watchers shattering into static, mirrors shattering inwards, rooms folding into blackness. Not collapse, release. The archive had built itself on a lie that stillness could preserve truth. That memory, once frozen, was pure. But Micah had shown it the flaw. That memory lives in motion. In turning away, in refusing the frame, the boy began to fade, his shape becoming film. Then shadow, then nothing. Micah stood alone again. But now the room knew him, the true him. The one who had faced every iteration, who had walked every corridor, who had seen every mimicry and never blinked. And the room began to close. Not shut. Seal. It would not open again. Because it no longer needed to. Micah turned, stepping back into the world. And when he crossed the threshold, the hallway was gone. No door, no slab, no sign it had ever existed. Only one thing remained, tucked in his pocket. A single Polaroid, newly developed. It showed him and the boy in the chair. One standing, one seated. But no camera had taken it. No frame had allowed it. It had simply remembered itself. And beneath the image, written in ink so faint it almost wasn't there, "You are not what was taken." You are what was left behind. Micah looked up, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt free. But freedom has a cost. And behind the next mirror he passed, something turned toward him and smiled. Click. The world didn't change overnight. It never does. Not even when something unspeakably large dies, or worse, learns how to pretend it's dead. People kept going. They brushed their teeth, paid bills, fought and made up. But beneath the fabric of daily life, something tugged. Subtle, sharp, like a hangnail on the edge of reality. Micah felt it first. Of course, the way someone who has lived too long in silence can hear the tiniest echo of a returning voice. Because the archive hadn't gone quiet. It had gone inward. Stripped of corridors and systems, it no longer hunted in physical space. It had turned to something more intimate: memory recall, dream repetition, déjà vu, small things, invasive things, most wouldn't notice. That was the point. A glance that lingered too long in a photo. A sound in a voicemail you don't remember listening to. The feeling of watching yourself from a corner of the room. These were its tools now. Not cameras, not watchers, but yourself, your own memory, used against you. Micah stood on the roof of a parking garage in a city that didn't exist 5 years ago. A place built too fast, too polished. All glass and reflections. A playground for the archive's new tricks. He watched the skyline shimmer under evening haze, and in every window, in every mirrored facade, he could see not himself, but someone watching him. Slight differences. A gesture out of sync. A shadow with no source. That's how it worked now. Quiet recursion. Like a song you didn't realize was looping until it never stopped. A girl joined him there. Mara, one of the others. She'd been 9 when her reflection vanished for 6 full days. Now she was 12 and too old in the eyes. She didn't speak when she arrived, just nodded. She knew why he was there. The others had begun to gather again, not out of fear, but understanding. Because the archive was creeping back into the cracks it had left behind. They're not just reflections anymore, she said after a long silence. They're trying doors. Micah didn't need her to explain. He'd seen them too. Closets that led to different versions of the same room. Elevators that stopped on non-existent floors. A hallway that grew longer the more you walked it, while the photos on the wall slowly changed into unfamiliar faces with eyes scribbled out in pen. These weren't places the archive had built. They were places you built by thinking about them. Because that was its newest trick, making you frame yourself. A child in Missouri had drawn a chalk door on her bedroom wall after dreaming of it for weeks. She told her parents it would open soon. 2 days later, she vanished. The chalk remained. The wall was solid, but when they knocked, they heard her knock back. A man in Arizona bought a vintage camcorder online. It arrived broken, lens shattered. Still, when he plugged it into an old TV for fun, it showed footage of him sleeping, night after night, even though the camera had never been used. And in the final clip, he wasn't alone in bed. Something else was there, watching, smiling, framing. Mara reached into her backpack and handed Micah a Polaroid. The image was blurry, washed out. 2 figures in the distance. One tall, wearing something that looked like skin turned inside out. The other, small and indistinct. A child, hard to tell. Written on the bottom edge, "We forgot to forget." Micah turned it over. The back had a single smudge, a thumbprint not his own. It wasn't ink. It wasn't dirt. It was film. Actual photo film, smeared raw across the paper, like someone tried to drag a memory into the real world and failed. That came from one of the new rooms, Mara said. They're not random anymore. They're appearing around us. Like answers to questions we haven't asked yet. Micah didn't blink, because he understood the pattern now. The archive had learned. It didn't need to capture children who resisted. It needed them to understand it. Because once you understand something, once you hold it in your mind long enough to describe it, it becomes real. It gets shape, boundaries, a frame. And that was what the archive had always wanted. Not to imprison, but to convince. To convince you to frame yourself. And it was working. People were beginning to forget what came first, the moment or the image, the event or the memory. They were starting to write their own narratives around blank spaces. And every time they did, the archive grew a little stronger, a little sharper, a little more familiar. Micah folded the photo, slid it into his jacket. "We go back," he said, "to where the first cracks showed. Not room 6, not the motel. Before that, the origin of the Watchers, the concept. If we can break the idea, the system fails again." Mara looked at him, her eyes fierce. "And if it doesn't?" Micah didn't answer, because in the glass behind her, his reflection was already walking away. And it hadn't blinked once. Click. Long before the archive had watchers, corridors, and photographs, before the hum of static and the hiss of undeveloped film, there was only silence. A silence so deep it didn't feel empty, but expectant. And somewhere in that silence, something opened its eyes. Micah knew they had to go further back than any hallway, beyond any numbered room. Not to a place, but to a beginning, where the idea of framing something first took hold. Not the archive itself, but the thought that stillness could replace truth. That a moment, once captured, was somehow purer than the living, breathing chaos it came from. That's where it began. And if it had a birth, then it could die. They traveled without movement now. That's what the children called it. Slipping sideways into spaces that weren't places, guided by instinct, memory, and the cracks left behind. Mara had found a collapsed diner where the windows showed the sky from 20 years ago. Ellis, the quiet one, had stepped into an alley in Chicago and walked into a memory that wasn't his, one that kept looping until he whispered his real name and shattered it. These places weren't traps. They were anchors, pieces of time where the archive had tested its earliest shapes. They were getting closer. Micah felt it in his bones, an ache that hummed when he was near one of those frames, a space that had once served as a prototype for stillness. He didn't speak as they crossed a field that had no wind, but was full of movement. Grass swayed in opposite directions. The trees didn't rustle, but you could see their leaves twist. In the center of that field was a single door, freestanding, painted black, unmarked. They knew better than to touch it immediately. Mara stepped in a slow circle around it, watching the shadows it cast. There were 3, one that stretched ahead, one that curved back, and one that pulsed beneath it. Not a shadow of light, but of presence, of memory, of a moment so deeply framed it had forgotten it was ever real. Ellis placed a mirror in front of the door. The reflection didn't show the door at all, just an empty field. Micah approached last. He didn't hesitate. He'd seen this door before, in dreams he wasn't sure were his, and he knew what it held behind it. Not answers, not danger, but the first silence. He touched it, and the world folded. Not shattered, folded. Like a photograph being creased down the middle. Time bent in, reality cinched like a drawstring. And suddenly they weren't in the field anymore. They were in a room that had no architecture, no walls, no ceiling, just feeling, and at its center a mirror. The original, no frame, no silver backing, just a surface, smooth and infinite. They didn't see themselves in it. They saw the first child. Not Micah, not any of them. But the one who had sat still long enough to start all of this. The one who hadn't blinked. The one who had made stillness feel like safety. He sat in a chair facing the mirror, unmoving, untouched by time. But the horror wasn't that he was still there. It was that he never left. He had always been here. All reflections, all frames, all rooms, they spoke his shape. The archive didn't create him. It copied him. Over and over, trying to perfect a silence that wasn't real. Micah stepped toward the mirror. He didn't speak. Instead, he did the one thing none of the archive's watchers' lenses or mimics had ever dared to do. He turned away. He looked backward. And in that moment, the mirror cracked. not from impact, but from contradiction. Because turning away was movement, and movement was truth. The stillness broke like a dam bursting. The silence screamed. And for the first time in whatever the archive called existence, the frame itself bled, not red, not black, but images. Millions of them gushing from the mirror like smoke. All the photos ever taken, all the fake memories, all the rehearsals, the mimicries, the fakes, the loops. They poured out in a storm of failure, because the archive had forgotten the one truth it couldn't frame. Life does not hold still. Mara screamed as the room twisted. Ellis dropped to his knees, the pressure behind his eyes swelling. And Micah stood in the center and raised his hands, palms open, not to fight, to release. He whispered one word, over and over, unframe, 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 and the mirror collapsed. Everything went white. No, not white blank, emptied. For a moment that felt like forever, there was no time, no memory, no story, just presence. And then the room let them go. They stumbled back into the field, gasping, cold with sweat. The door was gone. So was the shadow. But something had changed. They no longer felt watched. They felt known. There was no click this time. No shudder. No hum of static. Only the sound of grass moving freely in the wind again. The first silence was gone, and in its place, the hum of a world that remembered how to move. At first, they thought it was done. That by breaking the first silence, by cracking the original stillness that birthed the archive. They had cut the thread for good. No more shadows lagging behind. No more mirrors holding their gaze too long. No more hum, no more click. Just life, unframed, uncaptured, moving. But peace has its own kind of tension. Not because it's fake, but because it's brief. Micah felt it almost immediately, like a breath being held somewhere behind the world. A hush waiting to fall back into place. And in that hush, something new took shape. Not a corridor. Not a room. Not even a shadow. An echo. It didn't belong to a sound. It belonged to a presence. Micah noticed it first in the city. He passed a man on a park bench and saw him again 3 blocks later, sitting in the same pose, same outfit, same blink. Not a twin. Not d'ade view. The exact same man. When Micah turned to look behind him, the first one was gone. A loop. Maybe. But not one created by memory. It was performed. Others began to notice it too. Mara saw her reflection cross the hallway before she moved. Ellis heard his voice come from a radio he hadn't touched. The world was responding to them in repetition, like a dream trying to retell itself with different details until it got the story right. The archive wasn't watching anymore. It was learning. Not by observing, by acting. And it started with the echoes. They looked like people. Familiar ones. But they were just a beat behind or ahead, always out of sync, always rehearsing. They didn't hunt. They didn't speak. They mirrored. Not to reflect, but to replace. One girl in Ohio saw her father sit down to dinner, twice. He entered the room, smiled, asked about her day. Then 5 minutes later, did it again. Same words. Same smile. When she looked back at the first one, he was gone. And the food on the table had been eaten. In Montana, a teenager woke up to find a photograph taped to his ceiling. It showed him standing outside his house at midnight, barefoot, staring at his bedroom window. He had no memory of leaving. But when he checked the dirt outside, there were 2 sets of footprints. One coming, one going, one real, one echo. Micah called a meeting. Not online. Not on paper. They gathered in a burned-out community center in the center of nowhere, the kind of place even memory avoids. There were 12 of them now, all marked by the archive, all still changing. Some had stopped aging. One had eyes that changed color depending on who looked at her. Another had a voice that wouldn't record on any device. They weren't kids anymore. They were carriers, not of a curse, not a trauma, of contrast, of proof that motion was possible, that the frame could be broken. And now, the archive wanted them back, not to silence them, but to use them. Because if the archive could copy what had resisted, it could finally become what it had failed to be, permanent. Ellis placed a cracked mirror on the floor, one he'd taken from a hotel where all the paintings had been replaced by blurred photographs. The mirror showed them all, blurry, flickering, but behind them was someone else, Micah. But not quite. This version didn't move in time with him. It stood still while he paced. It blinked when he didn't, and worst of all, it smiled. Not out of joy, out of understanding. They're not just learning us, Mara said, her voice quiet. They're preparing us, or trying to, as if we're roles they need to master. Actors, someone whispered. No, Micah said. Scripts. He looked around at the others, then back into the mirror. The echo of himself no longer stood. It sat now, calmly, folding its hands. I think it's waiting, he said, for us to break, for us to stop moving. Just once. Just long enough for it to become us. And that's when he realized what was coming. The archive no longer needed to rebuild itself as a system. It was rebuilding itself as them, one by one. Not in a rush, patiently, like a painter tracing over a figure until the lines feel real enough to live. And if it succeeded, the resistance wouldn't die. It would be replaced with something that looked like them, sounded like them, moved like them, but didn't change, didn't grow, didn't feel, just echo, forever. That night, Micah dreamed of a world full of copies. People repeating the same days, the same smiles, the same fights, the same deaths, all neat, all quiet, all captured. And at the center, a single frame, empty, waiting. He woke with a word in his throat. Not spoken, but understood. Rehearsal. The archive wasn't recording anymore. It was directing. And the only way to fight a script was to rewrite it. With motion, with mistakes, with chaos, with life. But first, they'd have to find the next echo. Before it found one of them. Because once the archive learned how to walk, it wouldn't stop. It would take the stage. And once it did, click, it wasn't sudden. That's what made it worse. The change came quietly, threading its way into the unnoticed moments. Half-turned glances, stammered words, pauses too long between thoughts. The archive had learned patience. It had learned to wait. And now, it had learned to inhabit. It no longer stood behind mirrors or whispered from doorways. It sat within, close, unblinking, just a breath behind your thoughts. Micah knew the signs. It began with a feeling, like you'd walked into a room and someone had just left. Or not left at all. Like you were wearing someone else's skin from the inside. Subtle until it wasn't. Mara was the first to catch it in herself. Her voice changed during a conversation. Not in tone, but cadence. She repeated a sentence midway, then finished it like nothing was wrong. But her eyes flicked sideways, like something inside her was watching from behind her own face. It's echoing me now, she whispered to Micah that night. I don't just feel watched. I feel occupied. They watched her closely after that. Every blink, every breath, every word, searching for lag, for repetition, for performance. But Mara was careful. Too careful. And that's what gave it away. She was no longer natural, no longer messy, no longer herself. The archive had moved past reflection and mimicry. It had learned that perfect imitation was useless if the host knew they were being copied. So it didn't copy the outside anymore. It sat behind the eyes, waiting for the right moment to step forward, and not just in Mara. Across cities and states, similar patterns emerged. A child who suddenly stopped using contractions in his speech. A man who answered questions before they were asked, then claimed he was just guessing. A woman who stared into a security camera for 10 minutes without moving, then didn't remember ever looking up. The archive had turned living people into puppets with their own strings. But the real horror wasn't the possession. It was the choice, because most of them didn't even resist. They welcomed the stillness, the calm, the clarity, because being directed was easier than being chaotic. Then choosing, then suffering the weight of uncertainty. The archive didn't force its way in. It invited itself, offering comfort disguised as peace. All it needed was a moment of pause, a single second where someone let go. Micah understood the risk now. The real risk, it wasn't being watched. It was being replaced by consent. He gathered the others. Those still untouched. Those still moving, still human, still unwritten. Their faces were tired, not from sleep deprivation, but from awareness, from constantly checking themselves for imitation, for false starts. They didn't trust their own laughs anymore, their own footsteps, their own dreams. So they stopped speaking, not out of fear, but discipline. Because the archive could only mimic what it heard. If they stayed quiet, it would falter. It needed their voices, their rhythms, their phrasing, their cadence. They called it the quiet pact. No words, no plans spoken aloud, only motion, only intention. It worked for a while, until the boy from Atlanta broke. He was too young, 11, maybe 12. He'd been the last survivor of a school where every student had begun speaking in unison, repeating lines from forgotten scripts. He'd lasted weeks with the group, until he laughed, suddenly, sharply, uncontrollably, at something no one had said. And when he laughed, they all knew. He wasn't the one laughing anymore. Micah caught him before he could finish the smile, wrapped him in a coat, covered his eyes, whispered the first words he'd spoken in days. "You don't get to have him." And the boy began to cry. Not for help, for permission. The archive had burrowed so deeply into his sense of self, he didn't know who he was without it. It wasn't puppeteering him. It had convinced him. Micah held him until the echo loosened its grip, until the boy's shoulders sagged and the silence returned to something alive. But it cost them something. They couldn't go back to the quiet pact. Not fully. Because now they understood the archive could listen even when you weren't speaking. It could trace intention. It could feel the weight of thinking the wrong thing for too long. From that day forward, Micah kept a shard of cracked mirror in his pocket. Not to look at himself, but to watch what else might show up. Because the real horror wasn't what was taken. It was what was layered beneath. The archive didn't erase you. It nested inside you, like a second self, a face behind yours. And every now and then, when he caught a glimpse of his reflection at the wrong angle, Micah saw it. The other smile, the one waiting its turn. Click. It started with a question Micah didn't remember asking. He was standing outside an old payphone, one of those rust-bitten skeletons from another century, when he heard himself say, "What time did I leave her?" The words slipped out as naturally as breath, but he wasn't thinking them. Not even close. He hadn't spoken to anyone in hours, and he hadn't left her. Whoever she was, that was how it began. Not with another watcher, not with a reflection. With a sentence that didn't belong to him, but used his voice all the same. The others started to report it too. Thoughts that felt like memories, but weren't theirs. Phrases that echoed in their heads like slogans or movie lines. Don't step left. Stay until the second blink. Remember the cold one. Each one slipping in when the mind wandered. During boredom, fatigue, sleep. It wasn't speech, it wasn't hearing. It was possession by suggestion. The archive had grown cleverer still. It didn't need to mimic appearances anymore. It had learned how to implant thought, to write inside their heads without using a pen or a voice. It didn't need permission. All it needed was space, a quiet second in the mind where something could settle, a gap between thoughts, a brief pause in your internal dialogue, and then click. You were no longer thinking alone. Micah tried to track them, the foreign thoughts. He wrote them in notebooks, on walls, in dust, every line that didn't feel like his. Each one felt unfinished, fragmented, like excerpts from a larger script they hadn't seen yet. Mara found one carved into the underside of her bedroom desk, etched in handwriting she recognized as her own. When you forget who thought it, it's already thinking you. The archive was no longer just rehearsing them. It was writing from within. Memories began to warp, not in large, dramatic ways, but in tiny, quiet shifts. Someone would swear they'd closed a door only to find it open, and be certain they had meant to leave it that way. Food you don't remember eating gone from the fridge. Scratches on your arms with no pain. Little things. Always little. It wasn't replacing them yet. It was testing, trying out different versions of their thoughts, posing alternate histories, asking what if you had done this instead, then what if you already did? It turned memory into a maze, and the only exit was certainty, a thing they were losing quickly. One night, Ellis confessed that he no longer remembered his sister's face. He had a photo, sure, but even looking at it, the features felt foreign. "She looks like someone I've seen," he whispered, "but not someone I've been with. I think something else is thinking her for me." Micah didn't say anything, because he'd felt it too. His own memories, especially the sharp ones, the painful ones, began to smooth over. The grief, the fear, the heat of those early days with the Watchers, dulling. As if the archive was editing him, softening the edges, reworking his past into something easier to wear, something more in line with the narrative it wanted. The script was no longer just being written. It was being revised, overwritten from the inside out. Micah started marking time the only way he could trust. Scratches on his forearm, 1 per day, physical, unmistakable. Pain reminded him he was real. Pain didn't lie. Not yet. Others followed suit, carved sigils into wood, braided strands of hair and tied them into knots they'd recognize. Left parts of themselves behind, not as artifacts, but as proof. Proof that they had once chosen. Proof that they were still choosing. They built a place, or something like it. An anti-frame. No walls, no corners, no reflections. A circular space in the woods surrounded by uncut stone. No symmetry. No script. Inside, they whispered only what had to be said. They called it the mouthless room. It was their resistance, their rehearsal space for truth. And one by one, they began to speak thoughts out loud. Not to believe them, but to pull them out. To name the ones that weren't theirs. To give shape to the invaders hiding behind their words. "I don't believe I forgot my mother's name," Mara said. "I believe something replaced it." "I never wanted to stop running," Ellis said. "That wasn't fear. That was instruction." "I remember the motel," another girl said. "But I remember it before I went there." The archive had seeded thoughts so deeply. Many of them couldn't tell where their own began anymore. But they'd found the weakness. Naming it. Voicing it. Dragging it into sound where it couldn't hide. Because silence was where it slipped in. Silence was its page. But a voice, a true voice, could ruin the script. Micah looked at the others, one by one. He saw the same flicker in their eyes. The suspicion that maybe, just maybe, they were already too far gone. Already halfway rewritten. But there was something else too. A different kind of fear. The fear of forgetting they were ever different. That was the final step. The archive wouldn't need to erase them. It only needed to convince them they'd never been whole to begin with. Micah stood, jaw tight, voice clear. "If it's going to take our thoughts," he said, "then we give it one to choke on." And together, under the open sky, in that crooked circle of stone, they spoke the same thought at once: we were never still. Click. Sleep became dangerous, not nightmares. That would have been easier. You could wake from those. No, what Micah and the others began to fear was the speaking. The way their mouths moved at night, long after their minds had gone quiet. Whispering things they didn't remember. Responding to voices they swore they'd never heard. Entire conversations had in slurred tones, half-lucid murmurs, and sometimes even laughter. Not their laughter. Something else's. Mara was the first to notice the pattern. She recorded herself with an old cassette recorder. Analog, immune to the archive's preference for screens and digital interference. The next morning, the tape was full of silence. Not dead air. Actual blankness. She rewound it 3 times, then played it backward. That's when she heard it, her own voice, repeating the same 5 words. Again and again. I know who you're not. Micah listened to it too. They all did. But the voice didn't sound like Mara. It had her tone, her breath, but the rhythm was wrong. It hesitated in strange places, stressed syllables like someone unfamiliar with speech. It wasn't just a playback. It was practicing, using her voice like a costume, a rehearsed draft of humanity. That night, none of them slept. But the voices kept speaking anyway. They whispered from the corners of rooms, from beneath blankets, from the mouths of those who swore they were wide awake. And they all said things that didn't fit. Things that sounded like dreams being read by something that had never dreamed. Micah's came as he stared at the ceiling, heart hammering after 3 cups of coffee. His voice, his exact voice, whispered from the foot of the bed. You didn't come back wrong. You just didn't come back alone. He bolted upright. No one was there, but his mouth was dry. His tongue tingled, like he'd spoken the words himself. Ellis began keeping watch during sleep hours. 3 hours at a time, flashlight in hand, writing down every phrase he heard. The paper filled quickly. Don't move when it counts. You already opened the wrong frame. She's not blinking. She's listening. Over and over, fragments. Like lines from a fractured script bleeding out of their mouths in the dark. The archive had grown past mimicry, past reflection, past thought. It had reached the core. The automatic, the unconscious. It didn't want to influence them. It wanted to use them, like radios, like channels, like mouths. They were no longer just vessels for memories. It was turning them into messengers. And they didn't even know what they were delivering. One night, Mara screamed herself awake, blood in her mouth, a bitten tongue. She pointed at Micah, eyes wild. You said something to me, she gasped. You told me to go to room 6. I told you no. You kept smiling. Micah hadn't slept. He hadn't spoken. But that wasn't the point. The archive didn't need him to. It could wear any of them now, not with masks, but with dreams. And the message was spreading. Children across the country were beginning to mutter strange phrases in their sleep. Entire towns reporting mass sleep-talking events, phrases in unison, like chants. One woman in Vermont awoke to find her toddler speaking fluent Russian. Her family had never spoken it. They didn't even know where he'd heard it. When asked what he'd said, the child answered calmly, I was just rehearsing. The word returned, always the same, rehearsal. This wasn't possession. It was a reading, a dress rehearsal of thought, speech, behavior. The archive had finally achieved its goal to make humans say what it couldn't, think what it couldn't, to complete the sentences it had written. Micah brought the group back to the mouthless room. No speech, only breath, only movement. They lay in a circle, stone to stone, hands linked, each of them biting their own tongue to keep from speaking. They called it the quiet watch. 6 hours. No one allowed to fall asleep. If you did, the others would know. Because the archive would try again, and again, and again. One girl failed. Annie, 15. Sharp as a blade and just as stubborn. She slipped into sleep for only a minute, and when she did, her lips began moving. Her eyes stayed shut, but her voice rose clear and sure. The script is nearly complete. Only one ending left. They shook her awake. She remembered none of it, but something in her eyes had changed. A dullness, not fear, resignation, as if she was bracing for a finale. Micah didn't know what the final scene was, but he knew who was meant to play it then. The children, the resistors, the ones who had survived every stage of the archive's evolution. They weren't threats anymore. They were roles. And the archive was watching, waiting, letting the story unfold one breath, one word, one dream at a time. Building toward the one moment it hadn't been able to write on its own. The ending, the choice, the scene where someone finally says yes, not out of fear, but understanding. Micah sat alone that night, eyes wide, tongue pressed hard against his teeth, and wondered, what if that someone was already him? Click. It came in fragments at first. Unrelated events, glitched moments, Murmurs carried across disconnected rooms. Nothing obvious, nothing loud. But Micah saw it for what it was, the story pulling tight. The archive wasn't grasping anymore, it was composing. The world itself had begun to feel aligned. Not in a comforting way, but in a horrifyingly deliberate one. As though life was no longer unfolding, it was being read. Somewhere between sleep and waking, between silence and voice, the archive had found its rhythm. No more trial and error, no more mimicry. The rehearsals were over. Now came the draft. The real one. The story that had been whispered across mirrors, written in shadows, bled into Polaroids. And the worst part wasn't that Micah could see the structure forming. It was that he could feel it fitting around him. Every choice they made was anticipated. Every twist they thought they had created turned out to be a step already written. Mara disappeared for 12 hours and returned with mud caked to her ankles and a journal full of entries she didn't remember writing. But they were in her handwriting, signed with her name, and predicted every word she said for the next 2 days. One entry read, "I try to break the script, but it adapts. It's not chasing me anymore. It's waiting for me to catch up." Ellis cracked quietly, not all at once. Not with a scream, but a smile. A perfect, painful smile that didn't reach his eyes. He sat at the center of the mouthless room and whispered, "What if we were never resisting? What if we were building it just by surviving?" Micah didn't answer. Because that thought, it was already inside him too. The final draft wasn't a map they could burn. It wasn't a file they could erase. It was them. Their movements, their fears, their defiance. It had absorbed every broken rule, every escape, every deviation. It hadn't failed. It had learned. Because to the archive, resistance wasn't a wall, it was material. And now, it was using that material to finish the story. It knew how they thought. It knew how they felt. It didn't need to guess what they'd do next. It had already written it. Micah began waking up with words in his mouth. Not spoken, positioned. As though each night the archive tucked a line behind his tongue and waited to see if he'd say it. Sometimes, he nearly did. They hovered there, just under breath, ready to leap if he stopped questioning. One morning, he found the phrase "I see you now" scribbled on his wrist in what looked like ash. He didn't remember writing it, but his hand did. The quiet watch fell apart. One by one, the others began to mirror themselves. They would start a sentence, stop, then start again with identical wording. No mistakes, no stumbles. Too clean. The archive had tightened its grip, not by force, but by style. It had polished them, line by line, into characters. Not human, not flawed, but symmetrical. That was how Micah knew he was still himself. He kept making mistakes. He stuttered, forgot things, changed his mind halfway through a sentence. That was what made him dangerous. That was what made him unusable. So the archive began isolating him. Mara stopped looking him in the eye. Ellis spoke only in present tense, voice flat. The others nodded too quickly, smiled too easily. They weren't people anymore. They were pages, and he was the margin being erased. He fled, left the mouthless room, ran into the woods, dirt biting at his heels, branches tearing skin from his face. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to interrupt the ending. He had to ruin the story before it finished writing him out. He found an old motel, run down, half collapsed, room numbers missing, doors sagging on hinges. But when he entered, the air shifted, not with memory, with anticipation. It was familiar. Room 6, not the same one, but the same idea. And on the floor, a single sheet of paper, fluttering as if it had just been dropped. Micah picked it up. Typed in black ink, "Final draft, scene 34, Micah enters the last unframed room." He realizes too late that this was always part of the story. Beneath that, a blank line, waiting for the next sentence, waiting for him. He stared at it, waited, and then he smiled. A broken smile, a real one. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a stub of a pencil. Then, in shaky, Uneven handwriting, he scrawled, "Micah tears the page," and he did. Ripped it down the center. The air screamed. Not with sound, but absence. As if something had expected a breath and choked on its own silence. The walls blurred. The light flickered. The room convulsed. Not like it was collapsing, but like it was recalculating. The archive had written too well, and it had underestimated the power of a mistake. Micah stumbled outside, lungs burning, ears ringing, but the silence didn't follow, because now the story was wounded. Now the ending was wrong, and a wrong ending meant the story could be changed. Click. The story should have snapped back into place. That's how it always worked, like a rubber band stretched too far. It would recoil and reshape around the mistake, correcting itself, punishing the glitch. But this time, nothing returned. The silence stayed broken. The frame? The archive's precious, invisible cage of storylines, of mimicry and perfect composition, hadn't just been interrupted. It had fractured itself trying to adjust. Micah felt the split. It wasn't visible to the eye, but it hummed. Like a dropped transmission, still echoing in the walls of the world. Everywhere he went, things were out of sync, dogs barking before they opened their mouths, clocks ticking backward for a second then restarting, people blinking at the wrong moments. The archive had spent so long perfecting its narrative that when one of its scenes was deliberately ruined, the entire system couldn't recover its rhythm. And the others, the ones who had fallen too deep into the performance, they didn't respond the way he feared. They didn't turn violent. They didn't even chase him. They simply froze. Ellis stood at the edge of the mouthless room, unmoving, like a paused film frame. His lips were parted slightly, his eyes wide, but there was no breath, no motion, like he was stuck mid-line, waiting for a cue that would never come. Mara sat in a chair inside, her hands perfectly folded on her lap, staring straight ahead. She didn't blink for 12 minutes. Micah tested them, spoke to them, shouted, whispered, nothing, until he said one word, "cut," and they breathed again. They blinked, they smiled, but the smiles didn't reach anything human. The archive wasn't dead, it was waiting. Micah realized the truth. His defiance hadn't killed the story. It had knocked the pen from the writer's hand, but the script was still there, ready to be picked up again. The archive didn't need to write all of them. It only needed one of them to continue. And that's what terrified him, because he had ruined the final scene. But in doing so, he had made himself the last page. It was watching him now, not to mimic, not to direct, but to become. He caught himself narrating his own actions, thinking in past tense, walking like he was being filmed, making choices not out of instinct, but with awareness of how they'd look from the outside. He wasn't resisting anymore. He was anticipating. That was how the archive infected you now. Not through mirrors, not through watchers, but through your own self-consciousness. The moment you began to imagine how your life looked as a story, it stepped in to finish the draft. Micah fought it the only way he could. He stopped making sense. He walked backward through town. He spoke in fragments. He tore pages from books and rewrote them with nonsense. He swapped his name every time someone asked it. He ruined the logic of his own narrative, and still it followed. In a gas station bathroom mirror, his reflection smiled before he did. In the fog-up window of a passing car, he saw his hand rise, and then his own hand lifted to match, not the other way around. The archive was in every possibility. Even his rebellion had been absorbed, written in as a twist. The only move left was one the story couldn't accept. He had to forget himself. Not his name, not his past. He had to forget he was a character. He had to shed the story completely, walk into the world as nothing but motion, randomness, pure reality. No motives, no structure, just existence, unframed. He went into the woods alone, left all names behind, burned the clothes that had seen the mouthless room, carried no photos, no memories, no lines of dialogue in his head. He sat beside a river and listened to water for 3 days. No narrative, no clicks, just sound. And for the first time, the archive wavered. It searched for him but couldn't locate the story. It sent whispers, false dreams, echoes of scenes yet to come. But he didn't answer, because there was no Micah to answer anymore. Just a body, a breath, a current. And then, on the 4th day, the river spoke, not in words, not in voice, but in absence. The silence that came wasn't hollow. It was free. It wasn't the archive's signature static. It was the sound of nothing watching, nothing waiting. Just space where a person could be without being shaped. He felt his name return. But it didn't weigh him down. It simply existed. Micah stood. The archive didn't scream. It shuddered. Because its frame, its precious blueprint for narrative control, couldn't contain something that moved without needing a reason. It had built itself around story. And Micah had chosen life instead, a life that couldn't be paused, mimicked, mirrored, or rewritten. It had taken 30 chapters, 1,000 fears, and countless shadows, but the frame, at last, had broken from within, and somewhere deep inside the collapsing corridors of a no longer rehearsed world, the watchers closed their eyes. Not because they were defeated, but because there was nothing left to see. Click. It had been 2 weeks since Micah abandoned the mouthless room, since he left names behind and let the archive's script collapse under its own weight. In the woods, under sky and silence, he had become something uncatchable, not invisible, just unframed. He didn't think in storylines. He didn't walk in arcs. And the moment he stopped being a character, the archive lost its grip on him. But even as it shuddered, it did not vanish. Something remained. A shadow. Not cast by light, but by memory. It wasn't his. It didn't move with him. It didn't follow. It simply waited just out of view, remembering him. That's how he noticed it first. By forgetting something important, then remembering it the wrong way. He reached for a branch he swore had once supported his weight, and fell. He doubled back, only to find the branch had never been thick enough to hold anyone. A slip. A lapse in judgment. No. The shadow remembered differently. The archive hadn't died. It had split. One part shattered with the story. The other remained behind, not as a narrative, but as a memory that refused to be let go. That's when Micah began to feel it, a presence made entirely of what had been. Not a person, not a force. A version of him, of Mara, of Ellis, of every voice that had spoken resistance, of every child who had whispered truth in the dark. It had compiled their choices, not as commands or plot points, but as echoes. And now those echoes walked, not toward him, not away, just near. They weren't ghosts. They were the previous draft. The one he thought he'd torn in half. He saw it first on the shoreline of a lake with no name. A flicker in the reflection, not matching the water or the sky, but repeating him wrong. It stood still while he moved, smiled when he frowned, mouthed words just after he thought them. And when he blinked, it was gone, but the unease remained. Micah began to feel watched again, not observed, recalled. The archive couldn't rewrite him anymore, but it could still remember him into submission. He heard it in the woods, a rustle that came after his footsteps, like something was correcting the memory of his walk. Leaves shifted not as they should, but as though an afterimage passed through them, trying to match the shape he left behind. He returned to a burned, out train station days later, one he'd visited months ago during the early run, and found a copy of his journal sitting in the ticket booth. Same cover, same pages, but the entries were different, happier, polished, structured like a story with lessons and themes. It ended with a line he never wrote. He found his peace, and that was enough. Micah burned it, but even as the flames curled the pages, he knew it didn't matter. The archive had stopped trying to change him. Now it was trying to convince the world that it already had, and that was worse. It was rewriting history, across towns, across names, across people long since gone. The mouthless room was now referred to in local whispers as a wellness retreat. Ellis's name had been listed in a news report as a missing drama student. Mara's photo appeared in a brochure for an art program in Ohio, with no mention of what she'd fought, what she'd seen. They hadn't escaped the story. The story had simply been redacted. Micah realized the archive's final form wasn't a frame, a watcher, or a scene. It was a reputation. A memory told wrong enough times until the truth went quiet. The children were becoming legends. Whispers. Stories of kids who had gone missing and might have just wandered off, or gone mad, or never existed at all. He had to act. Not to stop it. It couldn't be stopped now, but to interrupt it again. If the archive's memory was being built like a monument, structured, rivered, polished, then the only thing he could do was graffiti the stone. So he began. He traveled from place to place, leaving wrong memories. False ones. He told strangers nonsense. Said his name was different every time. Drew maps to towns that didn't exist. Told people the mouthless room was a circus, or a minefield, or a silent church that never opened its doors. He made up rituals. Claimed they'd danced. Not resisted. That they'd sung to the mirrors. That the archive had offered gifts. He broke the narrative again. Not by tearing it, but by cluttering it. Flooding it with noise so no one could agree on what really happened. Because the only thing worse than a lie is too many versions of the truth. He was no longer trying to save the past. He was trying to confuse the shadow. Because if the archive needed memory to survive, then it could starve on contradiction. And he was very good at being inconsistent. One day, he heard a child speaking about the boy who escaped the mirrors. On another, a woman described seeing a forest where names dissolve. He smiled. Not because they were right, but because they were all wrong. No story could be completed now. Not when every version twisted in a different direction. The shadow grew quieter, no longer sure which memory to wear, and for the first time in weeks, Micah stepped into the sun and did not see anything behind him. No silhouette. No double blink. No afterthought trying to walk him backward. The archive still existed. But now it was just one more story no one could tell right. And maybe that was the only way to win. Not to defeat it, but to make it forgettable. Click. Micah thought he was done with architecture. Done with rooms and corridors, with hallways that looped and walls that whispered. He thought, after unwriting himself and scattering the story, that the archive could no longer build around him. But it hadn't given up. It had simply waited. Silent, watchful, hiding in the leftover memories. Waiting for enough fragments to settle, to gather in the cracks he couldn't see. The first sign came in a town he didn't remember entering. A woman asked how long he planned to stay. He hadn't spoken to her yet. The second came when he found his name carved into a park bench. Not his full name, just M, but he recognized the handwriting. It was his, down to the slant and pressure. He hadn't written it. Then came the house. A simple one, tucked between rows of trees just outside a fog, heavy field. It looked like it had always been there. Weather, worn shingles, a creaking porch swing, windows too reflective for their age. It didn't glow. It didn't hum. But it pulled. He didn't want to enter. That should have been reason enough to run. But something in his feet said he already had. That's the horror of a story trying to reclaim you. Not that it forces your hand, but that it convinces your muscles you've done it before. Micah stepped through the door. The air inside was still, not stale, not musty. Still, in the way a breath holds just before the scream. The interior was too familiar. A cracked tile in the kitchen he remembered breaking. A blanket on the couch he hadn't owned in years. A photo on the wall of a group that hadn't stood together in one place since they tore down the archive's first iteration. Mara, Ellis, Annie, smiling, peaceful, like nothing had ever gone wrong. That's when he knew the room wasn't built to trap him. It was built to lure him into agreement. Agreement that the story had ended here, that this was the resolution, that they won. But it was wrong, too perfect, too resolved. Because the real end had no peace. The archive had built this place not out of memory, but out of desire. It had learned that people didn't fall into stories because of fear or danger, but because they wanted the version that felt finished. Closure was the most effective trap of all. He moved slowly, careful not to touch anything. The room shifted around him, not physically, but perceptually. The photo on the wall began to change, not in color or quality, but in meaning. The longer he looked, the more it felt like a memory instead of a fake, like something he should miss, should want back. That was the archive's final weapon longing. He found a journal on the table. It was empty at first, but as he stared, words began to appear in his handwriting. Micah returns home. He chooses stillness. He forgives the story. He tore the page, but another wrote itself behind it. Micah puts down the story. He lets it rest. He lets himself rest. Another. Micah stops running, and he felt the weight of it then. Not a lie, but an invitation. The room was a promise: stay here, and the archive will stop. It won't pursue. It won't remember. It will let you end. All you have to do is stop resisting. Stop doubting the peace. He stood in the middle of the room, every instinct telling him to move, to scream, to run. But those were the reactions of someone inside a story. He had to respond as someone outside of it, as someone who knew endings weren't meant to be given. They had to be earned. Micah stepped to the wall and began peeling back the wallpaper. Not with violence, with precision, as if he was unwrapping something fragile. Underneath was wood, not rotting, not aged, but fresh. The grain ran in perfect, mirrored patterns. Too perfect. Like everything here, it had been designed. He kept peeling, found a seam. Behind the wood was more wood. Then behind that, insulation that wasn't fiber or foam but pages. Thousands of them, pressed thin and flat, layered like walls, bleeding words he didn't recognize. Sentences looping. Paragraphs repeating. The entire room was written into place. Micah smiled, and then he spoke. For a room built to silence me, he said, you forgot I know how to ruin a scene. He struck a match, watched it bloom between his fingers, and tossed it onto the wall of stories. The room reacted, not with fire, but with confusion, as if it couldn't decide whether it was burning or rewriting itself to look like it wasn't. The walls pulsed. The floor rippled. The photograph on the wall flickered between joy and absence. The air shimmered like static caught in wind. Micah walked through it. Not out the door, but through the wall itself. Because now he understood the archive hadn't rebuilt the frame. It had tried to turn comfort into a snare, and he'd stepped through it without looking back. Outside, the fog peeled away from the field. The sky looked unfinished. No clouds, no color, just space waiting to be decided. He didn't smile. He didn't sigh in relief. He just kept walking. Because the archive's last hope was that he'd stay still. And Micah wasn't a character anymore. He was motion. He was memory in revolt. He was the page that wouldn't stay written. Click. Micah had walked so far that direction no longer mattered. The world around him had stopped behaving like a place and started folding like a thought. Terrain recycling itself under new names, trees changing just enough to pretend they weren't the same. He wasn't lost. That would have implied a destination. He was outside it now, beyond plot, past closure, past epilogue. He had broken through every frame, dodged every mirror, rewritten every scene the archive threw at him. And yet, somehow, it was still not over. Not because the archive persisted, but because he did. He began to feel it in his bones, something waiting, not hunting him, not correcting him. Just waiting, like a book left open on the final page, like an unfinished chord vibrating in silence. The archive wasn't rebuilding the frame anymore. It wasn't speaking through dreams or stitching voices into the air. It had changed tactics. It had become a question. and he was the answer that wouldn't give itself. He found himself in a clearing, dead center of nowhere, where the wind didn't move and birds never landed. In that clearing sat a single object, a chair, wooden, ordinary, facing nothing, and resting on its seat, neatly folded, was a sheet of paper, no title, no ink, just blank. Micah circled it. Once, then again. No mirrors, no echoes, no false voices. But as he stepped closer, he saw it faint indentations on the page, not drawn, pressed. Like someone had tried to write on it with no ink, still pushing with purpose. He tilted the page into the light. One sentence, all stories want to be finished. It wasn't a threat, it was a plea. The archive was no longer fighting him. It was begging him to conclude, because it couldn't end without his permission. It needed a closing image. A line. A freeze frame. Something to give the audience silence. That was its curse. It could control everything but the last word. And Micah understood, finally, what made him dangerous. Not his memory, not his resistance, but his refusal to stop. He folded the page in half, then in half again, until it was nothing but a soft square. He placed it on the chair and sat down beside it, not in the chair but on the ground, cross-legged, wordless. For hours he did nothing. For hours the world around him ached for closure. Scenes flickered in the trees, the mouthless room reassembled in snapshots, Mara smiling with a voice not hers, Ellis standing still, eyes waiting for stage direction. The archive projected them like desperate ghosts, like sketches needing confirmation. But Micah gave them nothing. No final line, no grand statement, no fade to black. And slowly the flickers dimmed. The images lost their color. The archive couldn't sustain tension without payoff. It couldn't keep the audience leaning forward if the actor walked offstage, mid-scene, and never came back. This was his last rebellion. No ending at all. He stood, left the paper, left the chair, left the clearing. And as he did, the air around him didn't click. There was no cue, no shift, no reveal. Only motion, only walking. And from that moment forward, no one ever agreed on what became of him. Some said he disappeared entirely. Others claimed he became myth. A whisper in the woods, a man who refused to be remembered correctly. A few insisted they saw him in towns that didn't exist anymore, leaving notes in empty gas stations, speaking riddles to children who laughed without knowing why. But no one could say when his story ended. Because it didn't. It just kept not finishing. And that's what broke the archive once and for all. Not fire, not mirrors, not silence, but an unfinished sentence. Still walking, still alive, still unwritten click, or maybe not.